She was 18 years old and her father sold her for $50. Not her labor, not her time, her. Standing in the middle of Caldwell Creek's main street, in front of every man, woman, and child who'd ever known her name, Harold Ashcroft held up his hand and called for bids like she was a mule with a bad leg. The crowd went quiet in a way that wasn't decent. The kind of quiet that means people are watching something they know is wrong but won't stop. And nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Until the sound of hoofbeats came from the far end of the street and Gideon Holt rode into town. Welcome back to another story. If you're the kind of person who believes a human being's worth cannot be measured in dollars, stay with me until the very end. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The morning it happened, Elena Ashcroft was doing what she always did before the rest of Caldwell Creek woke up. She was hauling water. 2 buckets, one in each hand, the wooden yoke rubbing a familiar callus into the back of her neck. The well was 40 yards from the shack her father called home, across a stretch of hard-packed dirt where nothing grew anymore, not even weeds. She made the walk 4 times every morning. By the time the sun cleared the ridge to the east, she'd already done more work than most people in town did before noon. She was used to it. That was the honest truth. She was used to the ache in her shoulders, used to the creak of the floorboards when her father stumbled in past midnight, used to the sound of bottles knocking against each other under the bed. She was 18 years old, and she had never known a morning that didn't begin with work and end with exhaustion, and somewhere along the way she had stopped expecting anything different. What she was not used to was coming back to the shack and finding it empty. Her father's boots were gone from beside the door. His coat, the heavy canvas one with the torn left pocket, was missing from its nail. Elena set the buckets down and stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at the dim interior. The smell of cheap whiskey and old smoke clung to everything. The walls, the bedding, the single table pushed against the far wall where a cracked plate and a rusted fork sat from last night's supper. She told herself he'd gone to Finley's, the saloon on the west end of town. He did that sometimes early when the drinking from the night before hadn't quite taken the edge off whatever was eating at him. She told herself she'd go about her morning, get the fire started, maybe see if there were eggs the old brown hen had left behind the woodpile. She told herself not to worry. She was bad at that. By mid-morning, she'd finished her chores and walked the half-mile into Caldwell Creek proper to trade a bundle of dried herbs she'd gathered, chamomile, yarrow, a little sage, for salt and a length of thread she needed to mend the knee of her only decent skirt. Mrs. Pullman at the dry goods store took the bundle without much comment, weighed it, and gave her fair trade. That was about the best Elena could say for Caldwell Creek. Mrs. Pullman always gave fair trade. The rest of the town was a different matter. Caldwell Creek had maybe 300 souls on its best day, the kind of frontier settlement that existed because of the cattle routes running north and the small silver deposit somebody had found in the hills 8 years back, which turned out to be smaller than advertised but big enough to keep people from leaving entirely. The main street ran straight east to west, wide enough for 2 wagons to pass without argument, lined with the general store, the saloon, a livery, a land office, a doctor who was also the barber, and a church that doubled as a schoolroom on weekdays. Elena walked through it the way she always did, quickly, head slightly down, not from shame, but from years of practice at being invisible. People in Caldwell Creek knew who she was. They knew her father. And knowing Harold Ashcroft meant they looked at his daughter with a particular kind of pity that she had learned to find more exhausting than outright contempt. She was almost back to the shack, salt and thread tucked into her apron pocket, when she heard her name, not spoken, shouted. She stopped walking. The sound was coming from the direction of the main street behind her. She turned around slowly, and what she saw made the salt and thread feel suddenly very heavy in her pocket. Her father was standing in the middle of the street. Harold Ashcroft was a big man gone soft. The kind of frame that suggested he'd been strong once, 20 years and a great many bottles ago. He had her dark hair, but none of her steadiness in his eyes, which were red-rimmed and slightly unfocused even at this hour. He was wearing his canvas coat. His boots were muddy. And he was talking to a cluster of men gathered near the front of Finley's saloon, talking loud enough that Elena could hear him from 40 feet away. Said I'd settle what I owe, he was saying, and I intend to. Man's got to honor his debts. One of the men, she recognized Cutter Briggs, who ran a rough sort of trading post near the South Road and who she had always instinctively disliked, said something she couldn't make out, and her father laughed in that particular way he had when he was performing for an audience. I got assets, Harold said. More than you'd think. Elena started walking toward him, not because she thought she could fix whatever this was, but because some instinct told her she needed to be close to it, to see it, to understand what was happening before it happened to her without her knowing. She was 20 feet away when her father turned and looked at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before. It wasn't anger. It wasn't the dull blankness of drink. It was something more deliberate than either of those things, and it turned her stomach cold. There she is, Harold Ashcroft said. What came next happened fast enough that Elena would spend years afterward trying to reconstruct the exact sequence of it. Her father had debts. She knew that. She'd always known that, the way you know a roof has a leak before you can see the water, just from the particular way things feel overhead. She knew about the money owed to Finley for back tabs, about the loan from the land office for a parcel of ground Harold had intended to farm and never touched. She knew there was a card debt to Cutter Briggs that her father had been avoiding for months. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have imagined, was that the total had climbed high enough that Harold Ashcroft had decided he had nothing left to sell. Nothing except her. He didn't explain it to her, he didn't pull her aside, didn't lower his voice, didn't even look at her with anything resembling apology when he turned to the gathering crowd and said, clear as the morning air, my daughter, able-bodied, strong worker, 18 years old, good cook, knows the land. I'm settling my debts here and now, gentlemen, and I'm open to offers. The world went very quiet. Not silent. There were still sounds, a horse nickering somewhere, wind moving dust down the street, the creak of a sign above Finley's door. But every human sound stopped. The men near the saloon went still. Two women who'd been crossing from the dry goods store froze mid-step. Old Pete Larson, who sat outside the livery every morning on an overturned crate, stopped whittling. Elena stood in the middle of all that stillness, and she thought, with a clarity that surprised her given that her hands had started shaking, he means it. Papa? Her voice came out level. She was proud of that later. What are you doing? Settling accounts. He didn't look at her when he said it. He was looking at Cutter Briggs, who was looking at Elena with an expression that made her want to step backward. You've cost me more to keep than you've ever been worth. Time you paid your own way. I do pay my way, she said. I pay it every morning before you're awake. I'll start the bidding at 25, Harold said, as if she hadn't spoken. There was a sound from the crowd then, not quite protest, not quite approval, just that collective human noise that groups make when they're watching something they don't know how to categorize. A couple of men shifted on their feet. A woman turned and walked quickly in the other direction. Nobody left. Nobody intervened. Elena looked at the faces around her and understood something she had suspected for a long time. People in Caldwell Creek felt bad for her, but not bad enough to risk anything on her behalf. Cutter Briggs said, 25 is fair, and rubbed his jaw in the considering way of a man at a livestock auction. 30, said another voice. Dally Wren, who worked at the tannery and smelled like it, who was 20 years older than Elena and had a wife already, and whose participation in this made Elena's skin crawl in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. I can go 35, Briggs said. Harold was smiling. It was the worst thing she had ever seen him do. Elena turned to look directly at her father and said, very quietly, so only he could hear, You understand what you're doing right now. Harold met her eyes for just a moment, and she saw it there. Not regret, but something smaller and uglier than regret. He knew. He knew exactly what he was doing, and he had decided at some point in the dark arithmetic of his own desperation that she was a number that could be subtracted. 40, Briggs said. 45. From someone she didn't recognize, a rough-looking man near the back of the small crowd who'd ridden in on a horse she'd never seen before. 50, Cutter Briggs said, with the flat finality of a man who considers an argument settled. and then hoofbeats. She heard them before she saw him, a steady rhythm from the east end of the street, unhurried, which somehow made them more attention-commanding than if they'd been fast. The crowd shifted, heads turning, and Elena turned too, partly because everyone else was, and partly because anything that interrupted this moment was worth looking at. Gideon Holt rode into Caldwell Creek on a gray horse that was too good for any horse in this town. She knew who he was. Everyone in the territory knew who Gideon Holt was, the way they knew about sinkholes and dry lightning storms, things you learned about for purposes of avoidance. He ranched 12 miles north, up in the harder country where the ridges ran close together and the winters came early. He was somewhere past 30, not yet 40, with a face that had been weathered rather than aged, and a quality of stillness about him that Elena had heard described as cold by some people and dangerous by others, depending on which story they were telling. He had killed 2 men. That was the version of his story that traveled fastest, though the details shifted depending on who was telling it. One version said they were rustlers who'd come for his cattle. Another said they were men from his past, something unspecified and dark. What all the versions agreed on was that it had been done without hesitation, and that Gideon Holt had not particularly tried to avoid the aftermath. He came down the middle of the street at a walk and stopped his horse about 15 feet from where Harold Ashcroft was standing. He looked at the crowd. He looked at Harold. He looked at Elena. And this was the part she would remember, because his gaze on her face was brief and assessing and contained none of the other things she'd been seeing in men's faces for the last 10 minutes. No calculation, no appetite. Something closer to appraisal, and not the kind that diminished. "What's the bid?" he said. His voice was low enough that people had to stop talking to hear it, which they immediately did. Harold blinked. He hadn't expected Gideon Holt. Nobody expected Gideon Holt at anything that wasn't strictly his own business. $50, he said. And she's worth more. Honest. Good worker. Young. Healthy. I heard you. Gideon sat easy in the saddle, one hand resting on his thigh. 50's the high bid? From Mr. Briggs, yes, sir. Gideon looked at Elena again. She looked back at him. She was not, at this point, capable of looking anywhere else. I'm not bidding, Gideon Holt said. The crowd made a sound. Harold's mouth opened. Cutter Briggs straightened with the expression of a man whose certainty has just been confirmed. What I'm offering, Gideon continued in the same unhurried voice, is a wage position. On my ranch. He was looking at Elena now, not her father. Fair wage. Your own room. Nobody touches you. You work, you get paid, you go when you want. Silence. That's not how this works, Harold started. She's 18. Gideon finally looked at Harold Ashcroft, and whatever Harold saw in that look made him stop mid-sentence. She can make her own choices. He looked back at Elena. Can't you? It wasn't exactly a question. It had the shape of one, but something firmer underneath, like a hand extended that was also, in its way, a challenge. Elena's hands had stopped shaking. She wasn't sure when that had happened. She thought about Cutter Briggs and his calculating eyes. She thought about Dally Wren and his $30 bid. She thought about the stranger at the back of the crowd who had offered $45 without bothering to look at her face. She thought about her father standing there with his debts and his decision and his refusal to meet her eyes. She thought about 12 miles north, hard country, the kind of winter that came early. She thought, anything is better than this. Yes, she said. I can. She had 1 hour. Gideon Holt gave her that. He sat on his horse in the street while she went back to the shack and collected what was hers, which did not take long because what was hers was not much. A change of clothes, her mother's hairbrush, the one thing of her mother's that had survived Harold's various sell-offs over the years, a small knife she'd kept under her bedroll since she was 14, a tin cup, a few coins she'd saved from herb trades, hidden inside an old sock at the back of the shelf. Her father did not follow her to the shack. She was grateful for that, though she told herself she wasn't. She looked at the room once before she left, really looked at it. The low ceiling, the gaps in the wall where wind found its way through in winter, the dark stain on the floor from a lamp knocked over years ago, the general smell of a life lived poorly and without much hope. She had been here since she was born. She was leaving and she would not come back, and she felt, standing in the doorway, with her things bundled under her arm, neither grief nor relief, but something more complicated than either, the feeling of a door closing that you've had your hand on for years, finally swung shut. She walked back to the street. Gideon Holt was still there. He'd bought a paper bag of something from Mrs. Pullman's while he waited. She could see it tied to his saddlebag. It struck her as a very ordinary thing to do, and for some reason it made her less afraid of him than she'd been walking back. He looked at her bundle and said, "That everything?" "Yes." He nodded toward the back of his horse, where a second saddle was conspicuously absent. She registered this a moment before he said, "There's a spare horse at the livery. Larson'll lend it." Old Pete, who'd been watching from his crate with the expression of a man who'd decided he'd seen everything now, confirmed this with a nod that was also somehow an apology. For the crowd, for what had happened, for all of it. Elena accepted the nod for what it was worth, which was not much, but was something. The horse from the livery was a plain bay mare, older, steady-looking. Elena had ridden some in her life. You couldn't grow up on the frontier and not learn the basics. And the mare seemed unbothered by her, which she took as a reasonable beginning. She mounted up. Gideon Holt turned his gray north. She followed. They rode out of Caldwell Creek with the whole town watching, and nobody said a word, and Elena did not look back. The road north was not a road so much as a trail, two tracks worn into the earth by wagon wheels and habit, threading through the sage and bunch grass toward the higher ground. In late morning, the sky was wide and flat blue, the kind of sky that makes you feel both very small and very visible. And the wind came out of the northwest with enough weight to push against your face. They rode for a while without talking. Elena found she didn't mind the quiet. She had lived in it long enough that it felt more natural than speech. It was Gideon who broke it eventually. He was riding slightly ahead, not because he meant to, she thought, but because the trail was narrow in places and the gray horse had longer legs. "You can cook," he said. Not a question. He was repeating what her father had said, which meant he was asking whether it was true without wanting to put it as a request. "Well enough," she said. "Better than most men on a ranch, I'd expect." "Probably." He didn't elaborate on that. Another stretch of quiet. "You work cattle?" he asked. "Not much. I know the general shape of it. I'm stronger than I look." "I noticed." He said it without looking at her, his eyes on the trail ahead. She wasn't sure if it was a compliment or simply an observation. "What do you need done?" she asked. "On the ranch. What is there?" He thought about this for a moment in the way of a man who isn't used to being asked. "Cooking, keeping the main house, some work with the horses if you're willing. My hand Amos does most of the cattle work, but he's one man and the place is bigger than one man covers well." "How many cattle?" 300 head, close to. Bit more. That's a real ranch." "It's a working one." There was a note in his voice that she couldn't read, not pride exactly, but something adjacent to it. The way a man sounds when he's talking about something he's built himself and isn't sure you understand what that costs. "The people in town," Elena said, after another pause. "They say things about you." She watched his shoulders, because she couldn't see his face. They didn't tighten. "I expect they do," he said. "Should I believe any of it?" He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then, "Depends on which parts." "The two men," she said, because she had decided somewhere on the south end of this trail that she would rather know what she was riding toward than spend weeks wondering. He glanced at her then, a brief sideways look. "Rustlers," he said. "Came for 20 head I couldn't afford to lose. Gave them a chance to leave." A pause. "They didn't take it." "And you don't lose sleep over it." "I sleep fine." He looked ahead again. "They were going to kill my hand when they were done. Amos, he's been with me since the beginning. I don't apologize for it." Elena considered this. It was a very direct answer, and she appreciated direct answers, having received so few of them in her life. "I'm not asking you to," she said. He made a small sound that might have been acknowledgement. They rode on. What? She smelled the ranch before she saw it. Wood smoke and the particular warm animal scent of cattle and horses, which is not unpleasant if you've grown up on the frontier and have any practical sense. Then the trail bent around a stand of juniper, and the ranch opened up ahead of them, set in a wide, shallow basin where the land cupped slightly as if holding it. It was bigger than she'd imagined. 2 barns, a bunkhouse, a main house that was plain but solidly built, with a covered porch running along the front, a well near the house, fenced pasture rolling away to the east where she could make out the dark scatter of cattle across the grass. Beyond everything, the ridgeline, dark with pine, rising into a sky that was starting to gather clouds in the northwest. "Home," Gideon said. Flat, no embellishment. A man appeared from one of the barns as they rode in, wiry, maybe 50, with a weathered face and a limp in his left leg that was permanent looking. He looked at Gideon, and then at Elena, and then back at Gideon with an expression that managed to contain both surprise and composure in equal measure. "Amos?" Gideon said. "This is Elena Ashcroft. She'll be keeping the main house. Give her the room off the kitchen." Amos looked at Elena. "Ashcroft. Harold's girl." "Yes," she said. Something shifted in Amos's face. He clearly knew the name, clearly knew something of what it meant, and he made a deliberate choice to leave whatever that was unsaid. He nodded at her with a respect that was simple and unperformative. "Ma'am, I'll get the room aired out." "Thank you," she said. She dismounted, and the bay mare stood patient while she took her bundle down. The ground under her feet felt different from the ground in Caldwell Creek, harder, stonier, the kind of land that doesn't give anything without something in return. She stood and looked at the main house and the barns and the distant line of cattle, and she breathed in the wood smoke and the coming weather. "Kitchen's through the side," Gideon said. "There's a stove. Amos will show you where things are." "All right." He started to turn away with his horse, and she said, without quite planning to, "Mr. Holt." He stopped, looked at her. "Why?" she said. "Why not just bid? It would have cost you less." He looked at her for a moment with an expression that was harder to read than anything else he'd shown her on the ride up. "Because bidding was wrong," he said. "What your father did was wrong. I don't participate in wrong things because they're cheaper." He paused. "And because I needed help on this ranch, and you looked like you could do the work." It was not a declaration. It was not a grand gesture. It was practical and honest, and it told her something real about the man who'd said it. "I can do the work," she said. "I expect you can." He led the gray away toward the barn. Elena stood in the yard of a stranger's ranch, with everything she owned under her arm, and the smell of coming rain in the air, and she thought about what it meant to start over from a place of absolute bottom, what it felt like to have been sold in a street and to have walked away from it on your own 2 feet. It felt, she decided, like surviving, which was not the same as winning, but was not nothing either. She found the kitchen door and went inside. The room off the kitchen was small, barely enough for a cot, a shelf, and a hook on the wall, but it had a door that closed and latched from the inside, and when Amos brought her a blanket and a towel and pointed out where the water basin was, he did these things without any of the charged watchfulness that she'd always felt from men in Caldwell Creek. "Stove takes wood," he told her, showing her the wood box beside it. "Kindling's on the left. Mr. Holt likes his coffee strong. We eat at first light and at sundown. If you need something from the stores, just ask." "What happened to the person who did this before?" she asked. "The cooking, the house." Amos scratched the back of his neck. "Nobody did particular. We managed. Mr. Holt's not a man who requires much, but it's a sorry way to live, just managing." He looked at the stove and the bare shelves and the general evidence of 2 men living without any particular attention to comfort, and he said this without self-pity, just accuracy. "Be nice to have somebody who knows what they're doing in here." "I know what I'm doing," Elena said. "Good," Amos said, and went back to work. She spent the rest of that day in the kitchen. She inventoried what they had, which was sufficient but barely organized, the kind of pantry that results from buying things in bulk without a plan. And she put it in order. She found flour, lard, salt pork, dried beans, some root vegetables that were still good, Eggs, from what she gathered, were a small flock of chickens somewhere behind the main barn. She built a fire in the stove and heated water and scrubbed the kitchen table and found a cast iron skillet that had not been properly cleaned in what appeared to be some time and remedied that. She made a stew for supper. Nothing complicated. Salt pork, beans, a carrot, some dried herbs from the store she'd found in a cracked jar. But she seasoned it properly and let it cook down to something thick and good. And she made cornbread in the skillet, and when Gideon and Amos came in at sundown, she put food in front of them that tasted like someone had actually thought about it. Gideon ate without comment for a while. Then he said, "The bread's good." "Thank you." He ate some more. "The rest of it, too." She accepted this and didn't press for anything further. After they'd eaten, she washed the dishes while Amos told her, in his quiet way, about the ranch, where things were, what the daily rhythms looked like, which of the horses had a mean streak and which were reliable. He talked about the cattle routes, about the trouble they'd had last season with a stretch of fence coming down in the north pasture, about the way the weather moved through the ridges to the west. Gideon sat at the table after supper and looked at something, maps, papers, something she couldn't quite see, and didn't speak much, but he wasn't absent in the way her father had been absent, which was a disappearance from the world in every meaningful sense. Gideon's silence was the silence of a person who was present and thinking. She found it easier to be in the same room with than she'd expected. That night she lay on the cot in her small room and listened to the ranch settle around her. The creak of wood cooling, the distant sound of cattle, the wind against the window. And she thought about the morning, about the street, about her father's face. She had expected to feel something devastating, fear maybe, or the specific grief of a betrayal so large it doesn't fully arrive all at once. What she felt, lying there in the dark, was very tired, and underneath the tired, something that took her a long time to name. Quiet. She felt quiet. Not peaceful. She was too honest with herself for that word. But quiet. Like a room after a storm has passed, when you're still not sure if the damage is done, but you can at least think again. She pulled the blanket up and closed her eyes. Outside, the rain that had been building all day finally arrived, moving across the ridgeline and down into the basin in a long, steady pour. Elena listened to it against the roof for a while. The roof, she noted, did not leak. That was something. In her experience, it was always something. She slept. The next morning, she woke before dawn without any effort, which was simply her life, and she built up the stove fire and had coffee ready before Amos appeared, and Gideon came in from what she gathered was a walk he made every morning, checking the perimeter of the near pasture before full light. He came in damp from last night's rain, and she handed him coffee, and he took it and said, "You're up early." "I'm always up early," she said. He nodded like this confirmed something he'd already suspected. They ate in a functional quiet, and when the food was done, Gideon pushed his plate back and said, "I'll show you the rest of the place today. Things you should know." She'd expected to be left to the kitchen. The offer, if it was an offer and not a statement, surprised her, and she tried not to show that it did. "All right," she said. He showed her the barns, the horse herd, 15 animals ranging from working stock to one or two that were better than working stock, including the gray he rode, which up close was even more impressive, and who watched her with intelligent dark eyes. He showed her the chicken coop and the root cellar and the south fence line where it ran along a dry creek bed. He showed her where the water came from. A good spring up the slope behind the main barn, running clean and clear into a stone cistern. He showed her the north pasture where most of the cattle grazed, and the storage shed where they kept the winter feed, and the small armory, which is what she privately called it when she saw it. Rifles, shotguns, ammunition, all maintained with a care that matched the way he maintained everything else. He didn't explain the armory. He didn't have to. 12 miles from the nearest town, with 300 head of cattle and a ranch worth enough to attract attention, you either kept weapons ready or you lost things you couldn't afford to lose. She asked questions where she had them, and he answered them directly. He didn't talk down to her. He didn't explain things she'd already demonstrated she knew. He treated the whole walk like a practical transfer of information between two people who were going to be working in the same place, which was exactly what it was. At the end of it, standing by the south fence with the morning fully broken around them and the ridgeline bright against the sky, she said, "You run this place very carefully." It's the only way I know to run it, he said. You've had trouble before. I mean, besides the rustlers. He looked out at the range. Everybody out here has trouble. What you do with it is the difference. She thought about that. She thought about the small armory and the good fence and the spring with its stone cistern and the care visible in every part of the place. My father, she said, and stopped. She hadn't planned to bring him up, but Gideon waited, and the quality of his waiting was different from most people's. Not pressing, but not dismissive either. He wasn't always like that, she said. I think. I was too young to remember before it got bad, but some of the people in town, Mrs. Pullman especially, she'd look at me sometimes and I could tell she was seeing someone she'd known before me, someone she'd thought better of. People make choices, Gideon said, enough of them, and you can't tell where the choice stopped and the man began. She looked at him. Is that what happened to you? Is that what they mean when they say whatever they say about you in town? A long pause. The wind moved through the grass of the south pasture. No, he said. What happened to me is different. He didn't expand on that, and she didn't push it, and they walked back toward the main house with the subject closed, but not uncomfortably so, in the way of two people who've acknowledged that there are things they aren't telling each other yet, and that this is acceptable for now. 3 weeks in, she understood the ranch the way she understood useful things, practically, from the inside, by doing them. She understood that Amos's limp got worse in the cold mornings, and that he'd never once mention it, and that the right response was to have coffee ready and not comment on his pace. She understood that the gray horse, whose name she eventually extracted from Gideon, was simply gray, because Gideon was not a man for embellishment, was the fastest thing in the territory and loyal to exactly one person. She understood that the cattle were good stock, well-tended, worth real money to the right buyer, which also made them worth real risk to the wrong kind of man. She understood that Gideon Holt woke before dawn every single day, that he was the first one on the property and the last to stop working, and that his whole life had the shape of a man who had learned the hard way that things fall apart if you don't hold them together. She understood that he was watching her, not in any threatening way, in the way of a man trying to determine whether he'd made a sound decision. She let him watch. She did her work. She didn't perform, and she didn't shrink. She was hauling water to the horse troughs. 4 trips, 3 full buckets each, 40 yards from the well, when Amos came to stand beside her on the second trip and said, without preamble, "He told me what your father did." "I figured he would," she said. "Doesn't sit right," Amos said. "What was done to you?" "No," she agreed. "It doesn't." "You got family anywhere else? Anyone who—" "No." She said it without bitterness. It was just a fact. "It's just me." Amos was quiet for a moment. Then, "Well," he said, "now it's us, I suppose." She set the bucket down and looked at him. He was watching the distance with his weathered face and his particular form of dignified understatement, and she thought that this was what it looked like when a person simply decided to include you in their accounting of the world. "Thank you," she said. "Don't mention it," he said, and picked up the other bucket and helped her carry the rest. 4 weeks in, the trouble arrived. She heard the horses first, coming fast from the south road, which was wrong because you didn't come fast up that road if you had honest business. She was in the kitchen, and she moved to the window and looked out and saw 3 riders coming into the yard with the energy of men who had already decided how this was going to go. She recognized one of them, the stranger from the crowd in Caldwell Creek, the one who'd bid $45 before Cutter Briggs outbid him. He'd been watching her that day not with the calculating look of a man at a market, but with the sharp attention of a man who sees something he considers already his, somehow. She had filed this away at the time and not known why. She knew now. She reached under the counter for the rifle Gideon had placed there on her second morning with the simple statement that she should know where it was and how to use it. She'd been shooting since she was 12. She checked the load. Then she went to the back door and called for Gideon. He was at the near barn, and he heard her tone, and he came without running, but without wasting any time. When he saw the 3 riders in his yard, he stopped beside her and looked at them with an expression she was beginning to recognize. Flat, very still, the look of a man who is processing a threat with all the emotion locked somewhere she couldn't see. "Know them?" she said. One of them, he said. Rourke. He works south of here, does some work for Briggs. She looked at him. Cutter Briggs. Yes. He glanced at her. Your father owed him money. I know. She paused. I think he was bidding on me on Briggs's behalf. Something moved across Gideon's face. Probably, he said. The lead rider, Rourke, stopped his horse in the yard and looked at them both on the porch, with the confidence of a man who has more people than you do and knows it. Holt, he said. I'm here for the girl. Gideon stepped off the porch. Elena came with him, the rifle in her hands with the barrel pointed at the ground, which was the appropriate position to carry it, and also made its presence impossible to ignore. Rourke's eyes went to the rifle and then back up to her face, and he showed his teeth. Set that down, sweetheart. We're not here for trouble. Then why are there 3 of you? She said. And why didn't you stop at the gate? Rourke looked at Gideon. Briggs has a claim. Money owed by her father. Transfer of... There was no transfer, Gideon said. She made her own choice, in front of witnesses. Briggs sees it different. Briggs, Gideon said, isn't here. A pause. Rourke was doing the math. 2 people on the porch, one of them a woman he'd already discounted. And the math told him what he wanted it to tell him. He started to move his horse forward. Elena raised the rifle. Not all the way to her shoulder, just enough. Enough that Rourke's horse shied slightly, and Rourke's hands tightened on the reins, and the man behind Rourke said something low and nervous. I'll tell you what I told my father, Elena said. I'm not property. I make my own decisions. And the next man who treats me like a number in somebody else's accounting is going to regret the math. She kept her eyes on Rourke. You tell Briggs that. You tell him exactly that. Rourke looked at her for a long moment. He looked at Gideon. Whatever he saw in Gideon's expression made the remaining calculation simple. He pulled his horse around. This isn't finished, he said over his shoulder. When you come back, Gideon said, bring more than 3. The riders went south at a pace that was faster than they'd arrived, and Elena lowered the rifle and the yard was quiet. She stood there for a moment, breathing. Good, Gideon said. She looked at him. Which part? All of it, he said. You didn't wait to be told. You didn't panic, and you didn't shoot when you didn't need to. He looked at her with something that was the closest thing to approval she'd seen from him yet. That's how you handle trouble on this ranch. Elena thought about Rourke's retreating back, about Cutter Briggs and whatever claim he thought he had, about the fact that this was not finished and they both knew it. They'll be back, she said. They'll be back, he agreed. And we'll be ready. She nodded, once, turned back toward the house. Behind her, she heard Amos's voice from somewhere near the barn. Well, he said, to no one in particular, that's one way to introduce yourself. She almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. Rourke and his men were gone by the time the dust settled past the south gate, but their absence didn't make the yard feel safe. It made it feel like the pause before a second stone drops into still water. You know it's coming, you just don't know from which direction. Amos came out of the barn proper when the riders were far enough south that their shapes had blurred into the scrub. He walked to where Elena and Gideon stood, and he looked at the empty road for a moment without speaking, the way old men look at things they've seen the shape of before. Briggs sent them, he said. It wasn't a question. Rourke, Gideon said. 3 of them. 3. Amos was quiet. That's a feeling out. He wanted to see what we'd do. He found out, Elena said. Amos looked at her, at the rifle still in her hands. And he did not look surprised exactly, but there was something in his face that was recalibrating. He'd been kind to her since she arrived, in his practical, understated way, but kindness and respect are different things, and what she saw in his expression now had moved into the second category. Come inside, Gideon said. We need to talk about what this means. What it meant, laid out plainly at the kitchen table over coffee that nobody particularly wanted, but everyone drank anyway, was this. Cutter Briggs had loaned Harold Ashcroft money over a period of roughly 2 years, an amount small enough that Harold could always tell himself he'd pay it back next season, or after the next good trade, or once things improved. Things had not improved. The total, by the time of the auction, was substantial enough that Harold had apparently convinced himself, or been convinced, that his daughter could serve as a form of settlement. He can't actually enforce that, Elena said. No, Gideon said, not legally. What he can do is make enough trouble that it costs more than it's worth. Cattle, Amos said. Gideon nodded slowly. He'll come after the herd before he comes after anything else. That's where I can actually hurt. Elena looked at the table. She thought about the north pasture, the cattle scattered across the grass, 300 head representing years of careful building. She thought about what losing even 50 of them would mean, not just in money, but in the slow, grinding destruction of something Gideon had put himself into. This is because of me, she said. Briggs wouldn't be pushing at you if you hadn't— Don't, Gideon said. Not sharply, just final. I made a choice in that street because it was the right one. I don't need you to carry the debt for it. She looked at him. He was looking at his coffee cup. I'm not trying to carry it, she said. I'm trying to understand the scope of it, so I know what I'm working with. A pause. He looked up. Fair, he said. So they talked about the scope of it. Amos knew more about Briggs's operation than Elena would have guessed. The trading post was a front, partially, for a rougher kind of commerce, moving cattle that weren't always documented, working with men who weren't exactly ranch hands. Rourke was one of the cleaner ones, which did not say much for the rest. There were at least 8 or 10 men cycling through Briggs's employ at any given time, not all of them in the territory simultaneously, but enough that a coordinated push on Gideon's herd was not an impossible thing to imagine. We've got 2, Elena said. 3, counting me. 2.5, Amos said, and touched his left leg without seeming to realize he'd done it. 3, Elena repeated, looking at him steadily, and he had the grace to accept this without argument. Gideon leaned back in his chair. He had the quality that she'd noticed before, in the face of threat, of becoming very controlled. Not cold exactly, but contained, everything turned inward and used instead of spent. He was thinking, and when he thought, his face went still in a way that made it hard to read, but easy to respect. We don't wait for them to pick the ground, he said. We set the terms. How? Elena said. That's the part we work out. Done. The working out took days, not hours, which she understood was how real planning was supposed to go. Her father had been a man of immediate reactions. Anger now, apology now, another drink now. And she had grown up understanding viscerally what it cost to never think past the current moment. Gideon was the opposite of that. He was systematic in a way that would have been maddening if she hadn't seen the results of it everywhere on the ranch, in the good fence, and the clean cistern, and the horses that were better than they needed to be because he'd made careful decisions years before anyone needed them to matter. In the meantime, the ranch kept its rhythms. She kept hers. She learned the land, not from a map, which Gideon had, but which only showed the property in flat, abstract terms, but from walking it, which she did every morning after the cooking and the water, taking a different route each time, learning the draws and the high spots and the places where the ground shifted from solid to something less reliable. She learned where the north fence had been repaired and where it still showed age. She learned the dry creek bed along the south boundary that filled after rain and drained fast, which meant you could move through it when it was empty without being seen from the ridge. She learned which direction the wind came from in the afternoon and how to read the way the cattle moved when something unsettled them, which was different from the way they moved when they were simply grazing. Gideon noticed her walking. He didn't ask about it, not for the first week, and she didn't explain it. On the 8th day, when she came back from the north fence line, he was at the porch with 2 cups of coffee, and he handed her one and said, "You're making a map." "In my head," she said. "Yes." He looked at her. "Why?" "Because if something happens," she said, "I want to know this land better than whoever's coming at it." He was quiet for a moment. "You've thought about this before, not just since Rourke came." "I've been thinking about it since I got here," she said. "Since your armory." He looked at her with an expression she couldn't fully name. Not surprise. She'd stopped surprising him, she thought, somewhere around day 3. Something more like recognition. The look of a person who has encountered an unexpected mirror. "Tell me what you found," he said. She told him. She told him about the dry creek bed and the sight lines from the ridge and the weak section of north fence that would be the obvious entry point for anyone coming from Briggs's direction. She told him about the hollow behind the east barn where a man could lie flat and see the whole approach to the main house without being visible from any of the obvious angles. She told him where the ground went soft near the well and where it was solid enough to hold a horse at speed. He listened to all of it without interrupting. When she was done, he was quiet for a while, looking out at the range. "You'd have made a good rancher," he said. "I'd have made one if anyone had given me the land," she said, not bitterly, just as fact. "Yes," he said, "you would." The wolves came before Briggs did. This was not unusual for the territory. They ran in a pack along the ridge, and they had an understanding with the valley ranches that was really no understanding at all, just the wolf's constant calculation of risk versus reward. When the reward got large enough, the calculation shifted. It shifted on a Tuesday, 10 days after Rourke's visit, when Elena woke at 2 in the morning to the sound of cattle moving wrong. She'd been on the ranch long enough by then that the difference between ordinary nighttime cattle sounds and distressed ones had lodged itself in her sleeping brain. She was up and dressed and had her boots on before she was fully awake. She took the rifle and went out. The night was clear and very cold, the kind of cold that has a quality like glass, everything precise and sharp-edged, the stars close enough to seem countable. She went to the east end of the near pasture where the sound was worst, and she saw them. 4 wolves working the edge of the herd, patient and coordinated, the cattle bunching in the panicked, shoulder-to-shoulder way of animals that know what the shapes in the dark mean. She fired once into the air. The wolves scattered, briefly. She heard the ranch house door, and then Gideon was there, rifle in hand, boots not quite fully on. 4, she said, east edge. He looked, assessed, and fired twice in quick succession at the furthest flanking wolf, which yelped and ran. The others broke after it. They stood in the cold together, listening to the cattle settle, which took longer than the wolves had. "That'll hold them tonight," Gideon said. "They'll try again. A different angle next time." "Yes." He looked at her. She was in her coat, but she'd come out fast, and the cold was real. "You should be inside." "You came out faster than I did, and your boots aren't done up," she said. He looked down at his boots, and something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile, because Gideon Holt's face did not do smiles easily, but the suggestion of one, the place where a smile might eventually form if given enough time. He crouched and fixed his boots. She waited. "Thank you," he said, standing, "for catching it early." "I know what wrong sounds like at night," she said. "I grew up listening for it." He looked at her with that quality of attention that she'd started to notice meant he was hearing more than the words. She didn't elaborate, and he didn't ask her to. They walked back to the house together in the cold, not quite side by side. The yard was uneven, and she was watching her footing, but close enough that she was aware of the warmth of another person moving next to her in the dark. It was a small, ordinary thing. She noticed it, anyway. The town came to her 2 weeks later in the form of Mrs. Pullman. She arrived in a wagon with her husband driving, and a look on her face that was carrying something she'd been holding for a while. Elena was at the well when she came into the yard, and she straightened and watched the wagon come in without any particular feeling, because Mrs. Pullman had always been fair to her, but fair was not the same as brave, and Elena had not forgotten the crowd on the street. "Elena," Mrs. Pullman said, climbing down with the care of a woman past 60 who wasn't going to admit her knees hurt. "I need a word with you, if that's all right." "It's all right," Elena said, because there was no graceful alternative. They stood near the well while Mr. Pullman stayed with the wagon and busied himself with something in the bed. Mrs. Pullman looked at the ranch, at the main house and the barns and the work visible in every corner of the place, and she looked at Elena, who was not wearing what she'd worn when she left Caldwell Creek, because what she'd worn then was worn out, and Gideon had, without fanfare, pointed her to a supply of dry goods he kept for practical purposes, and told her to take what she needed. "You're looking well," Mrs. Pullman said. "I'm working hard," Elena said, which was the honest version of the same thing. Mrs. Pullman took a breath. "There's talk in town," she said, "about Briggs. He's been saying things, about what he's owed, about Gideon Holt, about you." She paused. There are people listening. There are always people listening to whoever talks loudest, Elena said. Yes. Mrs. Pullman looked at her directly. I came to tell you, and I'll tell you straight, because I think you've earned it, that not everyone in Caldwell Creek is listening to Briggs. And what happened that morning? She stopped, started again. What happened that morning was wrong. I knew it was wrong when I watched it. I didn't do anything about it, and that's something I'll have to carry. Elena looked at her. Mrs. Pullman was not a woman given to speeches. This one had cost her something. Why come and tell me now? Elena said. Because Briggs is working himself up to something. Mrs. Pullman's voice was flat and certain. I've seen men like him before. They don't let go of a thing, and when they can't get it the small way, they get bigger about it. I thought you should know that people in town are watching, that if something happens out here, you won't be as alone as you probably think. Elena thought about that. She thought about how alone she had thought she was, not just in the last few weeks, but for years before, and how that aloneness had always felt like simply the truth of her situation, rather than a thing that could change. Thank you, she said. And then, because it needed saying, I know you gave me fair trade. Every time, for years. I know that was its own kind of thing. Mrs. Pullman pressed her lips together. It was nothing close to enough, she said, and we both know it. No, Elena said, but it wasn't nothing either. They stood in the cold air by the well for another moment, two women calibrating the truth between them, and then Mrs. Pullman said she should get back, and Elena walked her to the wagon, and when the Pullmans were gone down the south road, Elena stood in the yard and looked at nothing in particular for a while. Amos appeared from the direction of the barn. He had the gift, which she'd come to appreciate, of appearing at useful moments without announcing himself. Who was that? He said. A woman from town, she said, telling me Briggs is planning something. Could have told you that ourselves, Amos said. She also said we're not completely alone in this. Amos considered this. That's worth a trip, he said. Yes, she said. I think it is. Shh. Bitchin. Gideon's plan, when it came together, was not elegant. Elena had spent enough time in his company by now to understand that this was his preference. He distrusted elegant solutions the way he distrusted horses that were too pretty, on the grounds that both tended to fail when the ground got rough. What he built instead was solid and angular and depended on knowing the land better than whoever was coming. The core of it was the dry creek bed. The creek bed ran along the south boundary for most of a mile, dropping into a shallow ravine about 2 feet deep at the deepest, with brush growing thick on either side. It was the natural approach route for anyone coming from Briggs's direction who wanted to avoid being seen from the main house, which Gideon, walking it with her on a gray afternoon, confirmed was exactly how he'd have approached it himself. So we use it, Elena said. They were standing in the ravine, looking back toward the ranch buildings. From here, you could see the barn roof and the top of the main house chimney, and nothing else. They think it's cover. We make it a trap. Not a trap, Gideon said. Traps get people killed when they go wrong. What we're building is a choice. They come through here and find something very different from what they expected. He crouched and looked at the ground, the way the bank curved. We can channel them, get them into a single file where numbers don't help. And then what? She said. Then we talk to them from a position they can't argue with. You mean with guns? I mean with position, he said. Guns make the position possible, but what I want is for them to leave, not to have a fight. He looked at her. A fight is expensive no matter who wins. She crouched beside him and looked at the curved bank. If we move those deadfall logs from the west tree line, put them across the far end of the creek, it forces them to come through from the east only. And there's high ground on the east bank. She stood and walked to it, and she was right. The east bank rose sharply about 30 yards from where they were standing, topped with enough brush for concealment. From up there you can cover the whole length. Gideon looked at her and then looked at the bank and then back at her. You're going to need someone covering the back approach, she said. At the main house. Someone they don't know is there. Amos, he said. Amos. She nodded. And I can be on the high ground. A pause. He was looking at her with that still expression. I know how to shoot, she said. I know you know how to shoot. Then you're thinking about something else. I'm thinking, he said slowly, that if this goes wrong, I don't want you in the middle of it. If this goes wrong, she said, I'm in the middle of it regardless. This is my fight too. I'm the reason Briggs is pointed at your ranch. She held his gaze. Let me stand in my own corner of it. He was quiet for a moment. Then, the high ground east bank. You stay covered. You don't move from concealment unless I call for it. And if you need me to move before you can call, then use your judgment, he said, in the tone of a man who rarely says those words. You've got enough of it. She did not smile. She felt like it, briefly, but she didn't, because this was serious, and he was serious, and the moment deserved that. She just nodded. Show me the best angle from the top of that bank, Gideon said. And they spent the rest of the afternoon on the ground, making a plan that was not elegant but was as solid as they could build it, in the time they had, with the people they were. The signals came from town 3 days after Mrs. Pullman's visit. Not from her directly, but from her husband, who sent his youngest boy out on a fast horse with a note that said, in its entirety, Briggs left this morning with 7 men. Told Finley he'd be back for dinner. He won't be going to dinner. 7 men. Elena read the note twice and handed it to Gideon without comment. He read it, folded it, set it on the table. They'll come tonight, he said. They'd want the dark, and they'll want to be back before morning makes things visible. That gives us maybe 8 hours, Amos said. More than we need, Gideon said, but Elena could see the calculation in his face. 8 hours was enough, but not by a margin that allowed for anything going wrong in the preparation. They spent the afternoon moving the deadfall logs, 3 of them, each heavy enough that it took 2 people at the back end and 1 guiding from the front, over a distance of 40 yards through uneven ground. Elena's shoulders ached by the end of it, and her hands were cut in 2 places from the bark. And she did not mention either of these things, and neither did anyone else, because there was no point in mentioning them. They staged what they needed on the east bank: extra ammunition, a canteen, a length of rope whose purpose Gideon explained with a characteristic economy of words. They checked the sight lines twice, once in the afternoon light and once in the near dusk, when the angles were different and the shadows pooled differently in the ravine. They ate supper. Elena made it because the cooking was still her job and the rhythms of the ranch held even on days like this one. And she made it well, because she believed in not doing things badly simply because circumstances were difficult. They ate quietly, the 3 of them. Amos ate with the steady appetite of a man who had learned that you eat when food is in front of you because you can't know when it will be again. Gideon ate without appearing to taste anything, his eyes distant, still working through the thing in his head. You've done this before, Elena said to him, not accusing, just observing. Not exactly this, he said, but situations where you wait for something you know is coming. He looked at his plate. It's harder than it looks from outside, the waiting. I know, she said. He looked at her. Something in her voice had made the words precise enough that he understood she wasn't being polite. Yes, he said. I suppose you do. The night was clear again. Too clear, she thought, because a cloudy night would have been better for concealment, but you didn't get to pick your nights out here. You got what came. She was on the high ground of the east bank by 10 o'clock, settled into the brush with the rifle and the canteen, the rope coiled beside her for its specific purpose, which was not combat but signaling. 1 quick jerk on the line Gideon had strung between her position and his, 20 yards further along the bank. The stars were very clear. She lay on her stomach and watched the south approach and breathed carefully and did not let herself think about how cold the ground was. She thought about Caldwell Creek instead, about the street and the crowd and her father's voice calling for bids. She thought about Rourke with his easy confidence and the way he'd looked at her like she was a problem with a simple solution. She thought about Briggs, whom she'd never met face to face, but who had, in whatever accounting system he ran in his head, decided that she was collateral for her father's debts. She thought about the $50. The number was so small it was almost funny, and then it wasn't funny at all because it was the number a man had put on his daughter's life. And she had to sit with that for a moment in the dark, really sit with it. And then she set it down, carefully, the way you set down something sharp after you've understood how it cuts. She wasn't $50. She'd never been $50. She'd been Elena Ashcroft, who got up before dawn and hauled water and knew how to cook a decent meal out of poor ingredients, and had learned the land she stood on well enough to help defend it. Whatever her father had thought she was worth, she had never been only that. The sound reached her at 11:30. Horses moving slow and quiet, which is louder than horses moving at normal pace if you know how to hear it, because the rhythm is wrong, deliberate in a way that natural movement isn't. She counted the sounds carefully. She estimated 6, maybe 7. She pulled the signal rope once, sharp. From Gideon's position, 20 yards away in the dark, she heard nothing, which meant he'd felt the pull and was ready and was doing exactly what they'd agreed, which was to say nothing and wait. They came through the east approach, as she'd known they would, because the deadfall logs at the west end of the creek made the east the only viable option. They came single file, which the narrowing of the ravine forced on them, which was the point. She could see them from above, dim shapes in the starlight, moving with the confidence of men who thought the darkness was working for them. 7. The boy's note had been right. She let them get fully into the ravine, all 7 in the channel, before Gideon's voice came from the opposite bank, calm, carrying, the voice of a man who has calculated this exact moment. "You're in a hole," Gideon said, "and there are 2 guns on the high ground on either side of you and another at the main house. You can work out the math on that yourselves." The lead rider, it was Rourke again. She could see his shape in the starlight, the particular set of his shoulders pulled up short. The men behind him bunched. In the narrow ravine, 7 became a problem for itself. "Halt," Rourke said after a moment. "Briggs sent 7 men," Gideon said. "That tells me this was supposed to be a statement. I'm going to send you back with a different one. You can't hold us here all night." I don't need all night. I just need long enough for you to understand that this ranch is not a problem Briggs gets to solve by sending riders in the dark." A pause. "You go back and you tell him that the next group he sends here, I'll be at his front door the morning after with the county sheriff and a list of every undocumented animal that's passed through his trading post in the last 2 years. I've been keeping records. It's a long list." Silence from the ravine. Elena watched from the east bank and kept her rifle steady and did not move, because Gideon had not called for her to move, and the situation was doing what they had built it to do. "He won't like that," Rourke said finally. "I don't particularly care what he likes," Gideon said. "I care what he does. You make sure he understands the distinction." Another silence. She could see the shapes in the ravine, the shifting of horses, the particular way a group of men looks when they're recalculating and don't like the results. "The girl," Rourke said. "Briggs isn't going to let that go." "The girl," Gideon said, "is none of his business. She was never his business. You go back and you explain that to him clearly." Rourke was quiet for a long time. Then, "Pull your people back. Let us out." "When you're pointing south," Gideon said, "not before." It took a few minutes in the narrow ravine to get 7 horses turned around in single file. It was graceless, and she heard at least one man cursing under his breath, and she lay flat in the brush on the east bank and watched it happen, and did not feel victorious exactly, because she understood, she and Gideon had talked about this, that Rourke and 7 men retreating was not the same as Briggs deciding to stop. But it was tonight. Tonight they had held the ground. When the last rider was through the east approach and heading south, Gideon's voice came again, quieter. "Elena?" "Here," she said. "Come down." She climbed down from the east bank, careful on the slope in the dark, and she found him at the bottom of the ravine, and in the starlight his face had some of the color back in it that it had lacked for the past few hours, which told her more about what the wait had cost him than anything he would ever say directly. "Good," he said. "It held." "It held tonight," she said. "Yes." He looked at the empty ravine, at the turned earth where 7 horses had been. Tonight was information, for both sides. He looked at her. "You stayed put." "You said to use my judgment about when to move," she said. "My judgment was that you had it handled." The almost smile again, closer than before. "Get some sleep," he said. "Amos will take the watch." She walked back to the main house with the rifle and the rope and the canteen through the cold, clear night, and she was tired all the way to her bones. But underneath the tired was something she recognized from the morning in the street when she'd looked at Gideon Holt and made a choice without knowing where it led. The feeling of being on solid ground that she had put there herself. She went inside and hung the rifle on its hook and went to her small room and lay down on the cot, and she did not sleep right away. She lay there thinking about Cutter Briggs and his trading post, receiving Rourke's report, and what he would do with the information. She thought about the county sheriff and Gideon's list, which she had not known about until tonight. Another thing held back, revealed when the moment required it. She thought about what it meant to build a defense out of knowledge, out of preparation, out of understanding the land you stood on. It was different from the kind of strength she'd watched men perform her whole life. Loud and frontal and expensive. It was quieter, and it lasted longer. She fell asleep to the sound of the wind coming down off the ridge, and the distant, settled sounds of cattle in the dark, and she did not dream of Caldwell Creek at all. Briggs did not come himself the next day, or the day after that. He let the silence do what silence does when it follows a failed move, stretch out and fill with uncertainty, let the people on the other end of it wonder whether the quiet meant he'd backed off or was simply taking his time about the next thing. Elena had lived with Harold Ashcroft long enough to recognize the particular shape of a man working himself up to something he'd already decided on. The waiting wasn't retreat. It was loading. She said as much to Gideon 4 days after the ravine, when the silence had gone from tense to something more ominous, the kind of quiet that has weight to it. "He's not done," she said. They were at the south fence, checking a section that Amos had flagged as showing wear, and she was holding the wire taut while Gideon worked the staple. It was the kind of work that required just enough attention that conversation came easier because you weren't looking at each other. "No," Gideon agreed. "So what does he do next?" "Not the cattle. You threatened him with the sheriff. He knows you have records. He won't come at the herd directly." "He comes at something I can't document," Gideon said. She thought about that. "The water." He looked at her then, hand still on the fence post. "The spring," she said. "If someone blocked it upstream or fouled it, you'd have to move the cattle. That creates chaos, and chaos is when you lose animals without anyone being clearly responsible." Gideon was quiet for a moment. "I've been thinking about the spring," he said, "since last night." He went back to the staple. "You got there faster." "I've been thinking about it since this morning," she said. "I walked up past the cistern before breakfast. And? The approach from the north ridge is clean. Not much cover, but at night that doesn't matter. One man could do it alone if he knew what he was doing. Took me about 20 minutes to find the best spot for it." He looked at her again, and she could see him deciding whether to say what he was thinking. "You're good at this," he said. "Reading ground, reading what someone else would do on it." "I grew up reading a man who could turn ordinary into dangerous without warning," she said. "You learn to think ahead of it." He went back to work. She held the wire. After a moment, he said quietly, "I'm going to put a watch on the north ridge." "Amos can't do the ridge with his leg," she said. "Not in the dark." "No," he said. "He can't." She didn't say anything else, and neither did he. And it was settled between them without either of them spelling it out, which was, she'd found, largely how things got settled between her and Gideon Holt. Awesome. She took the North Ridge watch herself, starting that night. The ridge was a 40-minute climb from the main barn, steep enough in the last section that you had to use your hands in two places, and at the top the wind came in unimpeded from the northwest and was significantly colder than it was at ranch level. She dressed for it, layered, and she took the rifle and the canteen and a length of oilcloth to lie on because cold ground pulls heat out of you faster than wind does, and she was going to be up there for hours. The first night was uneventful. The second was the same. She came down at first light each morning and made the coffee and the breakfast and did not tell Amos how little she'd slept, because there was nothing to be done about it, and because she had a particular long-cultivated stubbornness about not performing difficulty. On the third night, an hour before dawn, she heard someone on the north slope. Not horses. A single person on foot, moving carefully, the way you move when you're trying not to be heard. She lay flat on the ridgetop and listened and placed the sound, and then she stood up and walked to the north edge of the ridge and looked down the slope. She could see him in the pre-dawn gray, a single man carrying something in both hands that had the shape of a heavy sack, moving toward the spring access, which was about 50 yards below the ridge top, following the exact line she'd identified 5 days ago when she'd walked it herself. She raised the rifle and fired once into the slope 10 feet ahead of him. He stopped. "The next one won't be at the ground," she called. A long pause. The man below her was very still. "Set down whatever you're carrying," she said. "And sit down. Keep your hands out." He did both. She could see, even from above, that he was young, younger than she'd expected, maybe 20, with the particular frightened stillness of someone who had thought this was a simple job and had just understood that it wasn't. She came down the slope carefully, rifle level, and when she got close enough to see his face, she didn't recognize him. He wasn't one of the men from the ravine. He was someone new, which meant Briggs had brought in fresh help, which meant the scale of it was expanding. The sack he'd set down, when she nudged it open with her boot, contained lye, enough of it to foul the spring considerably if introduced at the right point in the flow. She looked at him. He looked at the rifle and back at her face, and then at the rifle again. "How old are you?" she said. 22, he said. Then, 20. "Which is it?" 20, he said. He had the look of a boy from a poor family who'd taken the first paying work available, which was probably exactly what he was. "How much did Briggs pay you for this?" she said. A pause. $8. $8, she repeated, and another 8 when I got back. She looked at the lye sack, $16 to poison a working ranch's water supply. She thought about 50. She thought about all the numbers men put on things that weren't numbers. "Here's what's going to happen," she said. "You're going to pick that up and carry it back down the north slope, and you're going to go to Caldwell Creek, not back to Briggs, and you're going to tell whoever will listen that Cutter Briggs paid you to foul a rancher's spring. You understand?" He stared at her. Briggs will do what to you? Pay you less than $16? You go to Caldwell Creek, and you say it in public, in front of witnesses. That's the only way this is useful to anyone, including yourself. She kept the rifle steady. "Or I take you down to the main house and we send for the sheriff, and you explain it to him instead. Those are your choices." He swallowed. He was young and he was scared, and she was not entirely without sympathy for either of those facts. But she was also standing on a ridge in the cold at 4 in the morning with a rifle because someone had sent him here, and sympathy had its limits. "Caldwell Creek," he said. "Good choice," she said. She watched him pick up the sack and make his way back down the north slope until she couldn't see him anymore. And then she stood on the ridge in the coming dawn and breathed the cold air and felt the particular exhaustion of being right about something you'd hoped you were wrong about. She was down at the main house by the time full light came, and she told Gideon over coffee, and he listened without interrupting, and when she was done he looked at the table for a moment. "He's escalating," he said. "Yes." "This wasn't about the spring," he said. "This was about seeing what we'd catch and how we'd respond." He turned the coffee cup in his hands. "He's mapping us the same way you mapped the land." "Then we need to stop reacting," she said, "and make him react to us." The letter came from the county sheriff's office 8 days later. It was addressed to Gideon, and it was professionally worded, but what it said underneath the professional wording was that Cutter Briggs had filed a complaint alleging that Gideon Holt was harboring a runaway dependent, using language that made Elena's status sound murky in ways it was not, and requesting clarification of the circumstances under which she had come to be on the property. She read it over Gideon's shoulder while he stood at the kitchen counter, and she felt the particular cold of a bureaucratic threat, which is different from a physical one in the way that paper cuts are different from larger wounds, less dramatic but somehow more insulting. "He found a different angle," she said. "He's smart," Gideon said, which was not admiration but was acknowledgement. "He can't come at the ranch directly without giving me grounds to go to the sheriff himself, so he goes to the sheriff first." "Can he make anything of this legally?" "No," Gideon said, with enough certainty that she believed it. "You're 18, you made your choice in front of a street full of witnesses, and you're employed here with a wage." He set the letter down. "But it'll cost time to respond properly, and time is what he's buying. He wants us focused on paperwork while his people have room to move, she said. Yes. She looked at the letter. She thought about the boy on the ridge and the lye sack and the way Briggs kept probing from different directions, each time with something just small enough to seem manageable, each probe designed to teach him something about their defenses and drain something from their attention. We need to end it, she said, not defend against it one piece at a time, end the whole thing. But Gideon looked at her. I've been thinking about what that looks like, he said. It's not clean. It doesn't need to be clean, she said. It needs to be final. But she did not expect her father to be part of the final. She should have, perhaps. She understood in the abstract that Harold Ashcroft's debts to Briggs were what had started all of this, which meant that as long as those debts existed in some form, Harold was a loose thread in the story. But she had put him in the category of things she'd already left behind, and she had not thought carefully enough about the fact that leaving something behind doesn't make it stop moving. He came on a Wednesday morning, 3 weeks after the letter, on the same horse she'd watched him sell twice, and apparently buy back. He came into the yard at a walk, not fast, not confident, the walk of a man who has rehearsed something and isn't sure how it will land. Elena was at the well. She saw him before he saw her, which gave her the advantage of a breath, of getting her face into a neutral position before he registered her. Elena, he said. Papa, she said, out of old habit. It was the last time she said it, though she didn't know that yet. Harold Ashcroft in daylight looked considerably worse than he had on the street in Caldwell Creek. He'd lost weight, or maybe he'd already been losing it, and she'd stopped noticing. His coat was dirtier, and the red-rimmed quality of his eyes was worse, and he sat on his horse with the particular unsteadiness of a man for whom a horse had become harder than it used to be. I need to talk to you, he said. You're talking, she said. He shifted in the saddle. He looked at the ranch, the barns, the house, the ordered evidence of a working property, and something moved through his face that she couldn't fully read because it had too many things in it at once. It might have been regret. It might have been what regret looks like in a man who has never quite practiced it enough to do it well. Briggs sent you, she said. It wasn't a question. The shift in his expression confirmed it. He said if I talked to you, explained things, made you understand. Understand what? She said. That I owe him something. That you have any claim left on where I go or what I do? He says there's a proper settlement. There's no settlement, she said. I'm not a debt payment. I'm not a settlement. I'm not a figure in your accounting with Briggs or anyone else. She set the bucket down and looked at him directly, and the thing she'd been carrying since the street, the shape of it, the specific weight, clarified itself in that moment. You sold me for $50, Papa. In the middle of the street, you called for bids like I was livestock. Harold's jaw worked. He looked at the ground. I was in a bad way, he said. Owed more than I... You were always in a bad way, she said. I spent my entire life working around your bad ways, hauling your water, cooking your food, keeping the shack from completely falling apart, and all of it while you drank everything we had and called for more. She was not crying. She would not cry here, for him, over this. I'm not angry about the work. I'm not even angry about the bad years. I'm angry about the street, because whatever else you've done, that was a choice, and it was the clearest choice you ever made about what I was worth to you. Harold was quiet. He had the look of a man standing in rain with no shelter visible in any direction. Not sorry enough to be genuinely sorry, but shaken enough that he'd rather be anywhere else. If I can bring you back, he said finally, Briggs will settle the debt. The whole thing. New start. The words landed in a way that was almost funny. A new start, purchased with her return to the situation she'd left. The arithmetic was so like him, so completely, essentially Harold Ashcroft, that she might have laughed if what was underneath it wasn't so bleak. She heard the creak of the porch behind her. Gideon had come out. She didn't look back, but she knew the sound of him on the boards. This the father? Gideon said. Yes, she said. Harold looked past her at Gideon with the expression of a man encountering something larger than he'd expected. Mr. Ashcroft, Gideon said. His voice was level. Your daughter works here, with pay, of her own choosing. That means she makes her own decisions. He came down the porch steps and walked until he was standing beside Elena, and he stopped there and looked at Harold with the patience of a man who doesn't need to raise his voice to be heard. Now, you came here because Briggs sent you. You've said what he told you to say. She's given you her answer. He paused. Whatever you were before this, you've made yourself his errand boy. I think you probably know what that's worth. Harold looked at his daughter, then at Gideon. Something in his face went very still. Not the stillness of calm, but the stillness of a man who has run out of moves and has had to stop pretending otherwise. Briggs won't leave it, Harold said, and in his voice, underneath everything else, was something she recognized as warning. Whatever else he was telling her this much true. I know, she said. Go home, Papa. He looked at her for a long moment. She looked back and did not flinch and did not soften. He turned the horse and rode south. She watched him go, and she noted that she did not feel the thing she'd expected to feel. Not relief, not grief, just the particular tired clarity of a matter that has been properly named and set down. He won't go back to Briggs empty-handed, Gideon said quietly, beside her. No, she said. He'll tell him I said no. But he'll also tell him everything he saw here, the layout, how many people, whatever he could see from the yard. Yes. Gideon was looking at the south road, which means Briggs moves soon, while the information is still current. Tonight, she said. If I were Briggs, I'd come tonight. He's already waited too long. Another day and it starts to look like weakness to his own men. Gideon looked at her. Tonight, he agreed. They had 6 hours. It was not as much as she would have liked, and considerably more than nothing. Elena spent the first of them in the kitchen, which seemed absurd until you understood that a ranch in crisis still needs feeding, and that the work of her hands on practical things kept her mind precise rather than anxious. Amos came in while she was putting up cornbread, and he looked at the stove and then at her face, and he said, How many, you think? All of them, she said. He's not sending pieces this time. He's coming for it. Amos was quiet. Then, My leg's better today. She looked at him. He was not looking at her, looking at the window, his jaw set with the particular dignity of a man who is telling you what he can offer and won't discuss its limits. Good, she said simply. We need you at the main house. The high ground's mine, same as before. Gideon know you've decided that? Gideon and I will discuss it, she said. Amos made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Right, he said, and took a piece of cornbread from the pan before it was done cooling, the way he always did, and went back to work. She and Gideon discussed it at the south fence, where they'd gone to check the gate, an excuse to talk away from the yard, out of range of anyone watching from the road. Full assault, Gideon said, if he's sending everyone. He won't come through the creek bed again. He knows we've used it. He'll split them, some from the south, some from the east. Keep us looking 2 directions at once. 3 directions, Gideon said. He'll put someone on the north ridge if he's smart enough to have figured out that's where we were watching from. She had already thought of this. The ridge is covered. I'll be up there before they could possibly have a man in place, and the north slope is exposed. Anyone climbing in the dark will be visible from above. If they go wide around the ridge, then they add a mile to their approach, which means they arrive later than the other groups, which means they're out of coordination. She looked at him. It's not a perfect solution. None of this is, but it's the best shape I can see. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the south gate, at the road that had brought Rourke and Harold, and now whatever Briggs was loading up to send. I want you to know something, he said, and his voice was different from its usual register. Not softer exactly, but less guarded. What you've done here, since the first week, it's not what I expected. What did you expect, she said. Someone getting through, surviving until something better came along. He looked at her. Not someone who'd... He stopped, visibly uncomfortable with the sentence he'd started. Gideon Holt was not a man who spoke into vulnerable territory easily. You've stood in this with me, he said finally. That's what I mean. She looked at him and thought about the street in Caldwell Creek and the gray horse and the specific way a man looks when he makes a choice and doesn't dress it up. "This is my ranch too," she said. And then, because that needed clarifying, "I know it's not, legally, but it feels like it, and I work like it is. And if it goes to the ground because of something started over me, I'm going to feel that whether you want me to or not." "I know," he said. "That's what I mean. You care about it the right way." They stood at the south fence in the afternoon light, and neither of them said anything further because neither of them was built for saying the things that were beginning to be true between them. Not yet. Not with tonight still ahead. Chep. She was on the ridge by full dark, settled into the oilcloth, rifle ready. The night was overcast, no stars, which was both better and worse than the clear nights she'd lain up here before. Better for concealment, harder for reading movement at distance. She lay on her stomach and watched the north slope and the east approach simultaneously, and breathed the cold air and was very, very still. They came at midnight. Not all at once, so Briggs was smarter than Rourke had been. The sound from the south reached her first, carried by the wind, then the east, and then, just as she'd predicted, the north slope. Two men, moving carefully, 50 yards below the ridgetop. She heard them and located them before she could see them. Below at the ranch, it started with shouting. One voice, Amos from the main house porch, calling out that there were riders at the south gate. Then a shot, not Amos's, one of theirs, aimed high and wide, the kind of shot that's more announcement than aggression. The two men on the north slope froze. She fired once into the slope ahead of them, same as she'd done with the boy, and called, "Stop there!" They did. She counted on them being smarter than they were brave, which was generally reliable with hired men who had no personal stake in the outcome. "Back down," she said. "Now, tell your boss the north is closed." A pause. Then the sound of two men deciding the pay wasn't enough, and going back the way they'd come. She turned her attention to the east approach, where she could see, distantly, through the dark, 3 riders coming at a pace that meant they weren't trying for surprise anymore. The shooting at the south gate had told everyone where things stood. She tracked them and fired twice, both shots at the ground ahead of the lead horse, which shied hard and through the rhythm of all 3 of them. They pulled up. From below, Gideon's voice, carrying, controlled, the voice she'd heard in the ravine. "Count what you're riding into before you keep coming." 3 at the east. She couldn't see the south clearly from the ridge, but she could hear it. Amos and at least one other voice, the specific cadence of men trying to hold ground. A second shot from the south, this one closer to something. Then a voice she had not expected. Cutter Briggs himself. She recognized him from the trading post which she'd been to twice in her life. A broad man, heavy through the shoulders, with the well-maintained appearance of someone who'd put effort into looking more legitimate than he was. He was at the south gate, and he was not on horseback. He was standing, which meant he'd come in a wagon, or on foot, which meant he'd come to talk as much as to fight, which meant he understood that the fight part wasn't going the way he'd planned. "Halt!" Briggs's voice was big. "This is enough. You want to talk terms? I'll talk terms." Elena came down from the ridge faster than was strictly safe, taking the steep section with more speed than care, because she needed to be at the south gate for this conversation, and she knew, in the specific way she'd come to know things about the people in this story, that Gideon would handle it better with her there. She came around the east barn at a run and slowed to a walk for the last 30 feet, because arriving out of breath was not the impression she needed to make. Briggs was at the gate with 3 men around him and a lantern in one hand, which cast a circle of orange light that made everything outside it look darker by contrast. Gideon was 15 feet inside the gate, rifle low. Amos was on the porch, covering the south road. 2 of Briggs's riders had their horses pulled up at the gate and were looking at Amos and at Gideon and at each other with the expression of men reconsidering their employment. Elena walked past Gideon and stopped 4 feet from the gate. Briggs looked at her. He had the expression of a man who'd done the arithmetic and didn't like the sum. "You want terms," she said. "Say them." Briggs looked at Gideon. "I'd rather talk to... "You'll talk to me," she said. "This started with me. It ends with me." A pause. Briggs's jaw tightened, then released. He was a man who understood leverage, which meant he understood when he didn't have it. The debt Harold Ashcroft owes me, he said. I want it clear. Harold Ashcroft's debts are Harold Ashcroft's debts, she said. They have nothing to do with me. He used you as collateral. He used me as collateral without my knowledge or consent, she said, which makes that arrangement worth exactly nothing. You're a businessman. You know what an unsigned contract is worth. Briggs looked at her for a long moment. He had the quality of a man reassessing something he'd underestimated, which she recognized because men had been doing it around her since she was 12. I sent 6 men tonight, he said, which was not the same as a threat and not the same as information. It was the kind of statement that means I want you to understand who you're dealing with. I know, she said. The 2 on the north ridge turned back before they reached the top. The 3 on the east approach stopped when I fired in front of them. Your man at the south gate fired once, and Amos answered him. She looked at Briggs steadily. Those are your 6 men. A silence. Gideon has records, she said. You know that. Every undocumented animal through your post in 2 years. That's not a small thing for a man trying to look like a legitimate businessman. She paused. And tomorrow morning, a 20-year-old boy is going to stand in front of whatever witnesses are available in Caldwell Creek and tell them that Cutter Briggs paid him $16 to carry lye to a working ranch's spring. Briggs' expression shifted. You had a complaint filed with the county sheriff, she said. Gideon will have a counter-complaint filed before the week is out, with considerably more documentation than yours has. She looked at him. You came here tonight because you thought this was manageable. I'm telling you, as clearly as I can, that it is not manageable. It is finished. The only question left is whether finishing it costs you more than you've already spent. The silence stretched. Somewhere in the dark beyond the lantern's reach, one of Briggs's horses shifted its weight. Harold's debt, Briggs said finally. Talk to Harold, she said. That's between you and him. Briggs looked at Gideon. Gideon had not moved or spoken, which Elena had understood was the right position for him. Not because she needed protecting, but because this was her argument to make, her ground to hold. And Gideon understood that the way he'd understood it since the first morning she'd picked up a rifle and walked toward trouble without being asked. I'll go, Briggs said. It was not gracious. It was the sound of the man putting something down because he's calculated the cost of holding it and found it too high. He turned to his men, and his voice lost whatever performance it had been carrying. We're done here. Move. Elena stood at the south gate and watched Cutter Briggs and his men go south into the dark, and she stood there until the lantern light had diminished entirely and the road was just a road again. Then her father stepped out from beside the gate. She had not seen him, had not known he was there. He must have ridden with Briggs or followed at a distance because there was his horse tied to the fence post, and there was Harold Ashcroft in his dirty canvas coat, standing in the dark with the expression of a man who has watched something happen and cannot figure out how to locate himself in relation to it. "Elena," he said. She looked at him. The night was dark and cold, and she was very tired and her hands were steady. "You're done, Papa," she said, not angrily, just true. "Whatever you owe Briggs, you work that out with him. Whatever you're owed, you collect it from somewhere else. But you don't come here again. You don't use my name with him or anyone else. You don't send messages through people you owe money to." She looked at him, at the ruined architecture of the man who had raised her badly and sold her worse. "We're done." Harold opened his mouth. Then he closed it. He looked at the gate, at the road where Briggs's lantern had been. He looked at his daughter. "I know," he said. It was very quiet. It was, she thought, the most honest thing she'd ever heard him say. He untied his horse and mounted up, slowly, the way of a man whose body has started to register its years. He didn't say anything else. He rode south. Elena turned back to the yard. Gideon was standing where she'd left him, rifle at his side. Amos was coming down from the porch. The ranch was still around them, the barns and the house and the good fence and the spring running clean up the slope, all of it still standing, still sound. Her legs, she noticed, had begun to shake. Just slightly, the delayed arrival of adrenaline finding its way out. She stood still and breathed through it and did not let it show in her face. Gideon came and stood beside her. "You all right?" he said. "Yes," she said. And then, honestly, Give me a minute. He gave her the minute. He stood beside her in the cold dark, and he didn't speak, and he didn't move away. And after a while, the shaking in her legs stopped, and she breathed the clean air of the ranch and felt, under the exhaustion and the cold and the strange aftermath of something that had been building for weeks and was now, somehow, over, felt the solid ground beneath her feet. "Is it done?" Amos said from a few feet away. She looked at the south road, at the dark it had swallowed. "It's done," she said. Amos looked at the road. He looked at the ranch. He let out a slow breath. "Good," he said. "I'd like some sleep." Elena almost laughed. Not quite. But it was close, and it was real, and in the particular exhausted dark of that night, it was enough. The morning after felt like the morning after a hard rain. The air different, the ground altered in small ways. Everything still standing but rearranged by what had passed through it. Elena was up before dawn, same as always. She built the fire in the stove and put the coffee on and stood at the kitchen window while the water heated, looking out at the yard in the gray pre-light. The south gate was closed. The road was empty. The barn shapes were solid against the sky, unchanged, the way good structures stay unchanged through the things that happen around them. She had slept 4 hours and woken without an alarm, which was simply how she was made, and she had lain on the cot for a few minutes before rising, staring at the ceiling of her small room and taking a quiet inventory of the night before, not reliving it, just accounting for it, the way you account for a large expense to make sure you understand where you are financially afterward. Briggs was gone. Her father was gone. The South Road was just a road again. She felt the truth of it cautiously, the way you feel a mended fence post before you trust your weight to it. Because she had learned, in 18 years of living with a man who manufactured crises the way some men manufactured excuses, that the end of one trouble was rarely the end of trouble itself. There was always the next thing. She had built her whole interior life around the expectation of the next thing. The coffee was ready. She poured 2 cups because Gideon's step on the porch came right as the pot came off the heat. She'd noticed weeks ago that he had a near-perfect internal clock, and she handed him his cup when he came through the door, and he took it and stood beside her at the window, and they looked at the same empty yard in companionable quiet. After a while he said, "Amos's leg is bad this morning." "I know," she said. "He was favoring it on the porch steps last night." "He won't say so." "No," she said. "He won't." "I'll take the east fence check today. You don't need to—" "I'll go with you," she said. 2 people find things faster than one. He looked at her for a moment with that expression she'd stopped trying to fully read and had started simply accepting, attentive, measuring, something underneath that had been accumulating since the first week and had not yet found its way into words between them. Then he looked back at the window. "All right," he said. They rode the east fence line after breakfast, a stretch of nearly 2 miles that backed up against the harder country where the ridge came down close to the property boundary. The morning had warmed slightly from the overnight cold, the way fall mornings sometimes do before reminding you what season it is, and the light was clean and pale across the grass where the cattle moved in their slow, purposeful way. They found 3 sections needing attention, 1 post pulled by an animal, 1 stretch where the wire had rusted through at a staple, 1 spot near the north corner that had been disturbed by what were clearly boot prints in the soft earth, one of Briggs's men scouting the night before last. Gideon looked at the boot prints without comment. Elena looked at them, and then at the angle from the fence, and then at the angle from the ridge above. "He had a view of the north pasture from here," she said. "If he came in the dark, he could count the herd." "He already knows roughly what's here," Gideon said. "He's known for a while." "Knowing and being certain are different things," she said. He was making sure. She looked at the fence. "We should move the herd south for a few weeks. Rotate them to the lower pasture. If anyone's still watching, they'll see fewer animals from the easy angles and have to work harder to assess." Gideon was quiet for a moment. He pulled the wire tool from his saddlebag and crouched at the rusted section. "Hand me the splice from the left bag." She found it and handed it down. He worked the splice with the focused efficiency of a man who has done this 10,000 times and still does it carefully. She watched his hands and thought about how much this ranch was built in those hands. The fence and the cistern and the barn beams and the 300 head of cattle that represented years of careful, patient decision-making. "I'm going to put in for an extra hand," he said, without looking up from the wire. "Come spring. Maybe two." She looked at him. This was new. He hadn't mentioned it before. "The ranch can carry it," he said. "We're at the size now where 2 people and Amos are under what the place needs." He paused. "And Amos's leg isn't getting better." "He'd never accept being replaced," she said. "Not replacing, adding." He stood and tested the splice. "He'd still have the near barn, the horses, just not the far fence and the heavy cattle work." She thought about Amos and his stubborn dignity and the way he'd said my leg's better today the night before with a jaw set like a declaration. "You'd need to give him a reason," she said, "not just ease him out of the hard work. A real reason to accept help." "Like what?" "Like teaching someone," she said. "He knows more about cattle and horses than anyone I've ever seen. Give him a young hand who needs teaching, and he'll work twice as hard supervising as he ever did doing." Gideon looked at her, the almost smile. Yes, he said. "That's right." "I've had a lot of practice managing around people's pride," she said. "It's one of my less glamorous skills." He made a sound that was closer to an actual laugh than anything she'd heard from him before, short and genuine and a little surprised at itself, and she felt something shift in the air between them. Small, but perceptible, like a weight redistributed. They remounted and rode the rest of the fence line. The news from Caldwell Creek came 3 days later, through a source she hadn't expected, the boy from the North Ridge. He appeared at the south gate on foot, which meant he'd walked from town, which was either desperate or determined, and when Elena answered the gate, she saw from his face that it was both. He was cleaner than he'd been on the slope, and he was nervous in the particular way of someone who has done something courageous and isn't sure it was smart. "I said it," he told her, before she could ask. "In front of Finley's, like you said. There were maybe 12 people. I said Briggs paid me to carry lye to a rancher's spring." He swallowed. "I said your name. And Holtz." She looked at him. "What happened?" "People got quiet," he said. "Then someone went for the sheriff. Briggs—" He stopped, started again. "Briggs wasn't there when I said it, but Rourke was. And Rourke left pretty fast after." "Did anyone try to stop you while you were talking?" "One man told me to shut up." He looked at the ground. "Mrs. Pullman told him to let me speak." Elena thought about Mrs. Pullman and her particular form of late courage and felt something that was not quite warmth, but was in that direction. "The sheriff," she said. "Did he come?" "He came the next morning, asked me questions. The boy," she still didn't know his name, which seemed like an oversight, looked up at her. "He asked about the letter Briggs filed, about you." He paused. "I told him what I knew, about the auction, about what Briggs told me to do." "What's your name?" she said. "Cal," he said. "Cal Deering." "Cal." She looked at him. He was 20 years old and scared and had walked several miles to tell her this. "Why did you come here to tell me?" He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Because you let me go," he said. "On the ridge. You could have taken me down to the main house and sent for the sheriff yourself. You gave me the choice." He met her eyes. "Seemed like I ought to do something with it." She stepped back from the gate. "Come inside. You can eat." Cal Deering sat at the kitchen table and ate cornbread and cold beans with the focused efficiency of a hungry young man, and Elena sat across from him and learned in the way she'd learned things from Amos, in pieces, between other things. That he was from a farm family to the southeast, that his father had died the previous winter, that Briggs's $16 had been the fastest money available when the family needed it. She didn't editorialize any of this. She listened and let him eat. Gideon came in from the barn midway through and looked at Cal and then at Elena with a questioning expression. She told him, briefly, what Cal had said in town. Gideon looked at the boy. "You walked from town," he said. "Yes, sir." "You need work?" Cal looked up from his plate. Elena looked at Gideon. Gideon was looking at Cal with the same assessing quality. He'd turned on everything and everyone since she'd known him. Not unkind, just honest, taking the actual measure of what was in front of him. I can work, Cal said carefully. I know cattle some. My father had a small herd. That's not nothing, Gideon said. He looked at Elena. She looked back at him steadily, because she understood what he was doing and she thought it was right, and she wasn't going to perform uncertainty about it. There's a bunk, Gideon said to Cal. It's not much. Wage is fair. Amos will tell you what needs doing. He paused. You work out, you stay. You don't, you leave without trouble. Clear? Clear, Cal said. And then, yes, sir, thank you. Amos, when informed, said nothing for a full 30 seconds, which was a significant silence for him. Then he looked at Cal and said, How much do you know about horses? Some, Cal said. Some is the wrong amount, Amos said. You'll learn more. He turned and walked toward the barn and said, over his shoulder, Come on then. Cal went. Elena watched them go and felt something she hadn't expected, a kind of satisfaction that had nothing to do with herself and everything to do with watching a damaged thing become functional again. A boy who'd carried a lye sack for a dishonest man, now carrying a water bucket for an honest one. The territory was full of people who'd made bad choices under bad circumstances, and most of them never got the chance to make a different one. That was well done, she said to Gideon. He'll earn it or he won't, Gideon said. But there was something in his voice that said he thought the boy would earn it. The county sheriff came to the ranch on a Thursday morning in the third week after Briggs's failed assault. He was a careful, gray-haired man named Talbot, who had the demeanor of someone who had seen most categories of human behavior and had opinions about very few of them. He sat at the kitchen table and accepted coffee and asked questions in the methodical way of a man building a record rather than a narrative. He asked about the auction in Caldwell Creek. He asked about Rourke's visits. He asked about the night assault and the lie in Cal Deering's statement. He asked about Harold Ashcroft, which was the question Elena had known was coming and had prepared for. My father made a decision, she said, about his debts and about me. I made a different decision. I'm here, and I'm working, and I'm 18 years old, which means the decision is mine to make. Sheriff Talbot looked at her over his coffee cup with the expression of a man calibrating what he was hearing against what he already knew. Briggs's complaint says otherwise. Briggs's complaint, she said, was filed by a man trying to leverage a legal mechanism to accomplish something he couldn't accomplish by showing up with 7 men in the dark. She looked at him. I expect you've seen that before. Talbot was quiet for a moment. I have, he said. His complaint has no legal standing, Gideon said from where he stood at the counter. She's not a minor and she's not a runaway. She's an employee. I have records of her wages. He'd been keeping those records since the second week, she knew. She'd seen the ledger entry, her name and the amount, written in his precise hand. Talbot asked a few more questions. He looked at the ledger when Gideon produced it. He looked at Elena. The boy, he said. Cal Deering, his statement about the lie. You aware of what he said publicly? He told me, she said. That corroborates a pattern, Talbot said, which was the most he seemed willing to editorialize. He finished his coffee and set the cup down with the care of a man who treats other people's things carefully, and he stood. I'll be speaking with Briggs. His complaint against this property will be dismissed. What he did with it, he paused, is a separate matter that's going to take some time to work through properly. Will it actually go somewhere, Elena said, or does it go into a drawer? Talbot looked at her directly. Miss Ashcroft, I've been doing this job for 14 years. A man who runs an undocumented trading operation and who sent hired men to poison a working ranch's water supply does not get a drawer. He held her gaze. He gets a file, and then a hearing, and then what follows from the hearing. She believed him. She wasn't sure why exactly. She hadn't had much occasion to believe in official processes, growing up the way she had, but Talbot had the quality of a man whose self-respect was tied to doing the job honestly, and that was a real thing she knew how to recognize. Thank you, she said. He nodded at them both and rode back toward town. In Caldwell Creek, meanwhile, the story had been told. This was not a thing Elena engineered. She had not gone to town, had not spoken to anyone beyond the ranch for weeks. But the frontier runs on information the way it runs on water, because isolation makes news precious. And what Cal Deering had said in front of Finley's had spread in the way things spread in small places, touching everyone and getting slightly changed in the touching, but remaining, at its center, what it was. Harold Ashcroft had auctioned his daughter in the street. A man from out of town had stepped in with an unconventional offer, and the girl had then helped defend the ranch against the man who'd tried to buy her. People are drawn to certain kinds of stories, not because they're simple, the good ones aren't simple, but because they confirm something people want to believe is possible, that a person can walk away from the worst thing done to them and build something from the other side of it. Mrs. Pullman came again 2 weeks after the sheriff's visit, with her wagon and her husband and a crate of dry goods that was clearly not a trade transaction, but was packaged as one out of tact. Elena met her at the gate and accepted the goods with neither false protest nor excessive gratitude, two things Mrs. Pullman, who was a practical woman, would have found equally irritating. "Town's been talking," Mrs. Pullman said. "I expect it has," Elena said. "Not all bad." Mrs. Pullman looked at the ranch with the assessing gaze of a woman who runs a business and understands what good management looks like. "The place looks well." "It is well," Elena said. Mrs. Pullman looked at her. "You look different," she said. Elena thought about this. She knew what different meant in Mrs. Pullman's vocabulary, and it wasn't different the way her hair was different or her clothes, though both of those were also true. It was different the way a person looks when they've stopped moving at an angle to their own life and started moving straight through it. "I feel different," she said. It was a simpler answer than the full one, but it was true. "There are people in town," Mrs. Pullman said, in the slightly circuitous way she had when coming to the actual point, "who are embarrassed about what they watched that morning. And some of them are," she paused, "interested in whether there's anything they can do about that." "They can do their business honestly and treat people fairly," Elena said. "That's a good place to start." Mrs. Pullman had the grace to look at the ground briefly. "Yes," she said. "I suppose it is." "Tell them the ranch could use reliable buyers for cattle come spring," Elena said. "That's the practical version of making good." Mrs. Pullman looked at her, and something in her face shifted into a respect that was different from the careful kindness she'd always shown Harold Ashcroft's daughter. "I'll tell them," she said. The work of the ranch continued. This is the part that doesn't make for vivid storytelling, but that Elena had come to understand was the actual substance of a life. Not the crises, but the daily labor that surrounds them, the thing you're protecting when you hold your ground. She cooked and hauled water, and learned more about the horses, and helped Gideon review his records for the response to Briggs's complaint, and rode the fence lines when Amos's leg made him slow. Cal Deering turned out to be a solid worker. Not quick, but steady, the kind of steady that compounds over time. Amos took him in hand with the ferocity of a man who has found a genuine purpose, and within 3 weeks Cal could handle the near pasture cattle check on his own, and was learning the difference between a horse that needed time and one that needed firmness. Elena watched this from the barn door sometimes, the old man and the young one, and thought about what people become when someone bothers to show them. The damage from the night assault, a section of the south barn wall that had caught a lantern knocked loose in the chaos, scorching the timber, got repaired in the 3rd week, and Elena worked alongside Gideon and Cal for 3 days of actual physical construction, hauling timber and holding boards and learning enough about the work to be genuinely useful rather than decoratively present. By the end of the 3rd day, she had 2 new blisters on her right hand and a splinter in her left palm that Amos dug out with a needle by the kitchen lamp, and she sat at the table afterward with her hands wrapped and felt the specific satisfaction of work that leaves a mark on you because it was real. Gideon sat across from her with his own coffee. His hands had more marks than hers, years of them, the cumulative record of what it cost to build something from ground up. She looked at them and then at his face. "Tell me something," she said. He looked at her. This was a new ritual between them. She'd started it about a month in, asking him something direct at the end of a hard day, and he'd started answering, which she hadn't been certain he would. "When you rode into Caldwell Creek that day," she said, "you weren't there for the auction. You had no reason to be there. Why were you in town?" He wrapped both hands around his cup. "Supply run," he said. "I needed salt and a new draw knife. Larson was holding a draw knife for me. And you just rode into the middle of it. Hard to avoid the middle when you're riding down the main street," he said. "You could have turned around," she said. "Plenty of people found a reason to look elsewhere." He was quiet for a moment. "I've looked elsewhere before," he said, "at things I should have stopped." He didn't elaborate and she didn't press, because she'd learned enough about Gideon Holt's silences to know that this one was covering something real and would open in its own time. "I was tired of it," he said, "looking elsewhere." She looked at him. "And if I'd been older, or not," she stopped, reformulated. "What if I'd been someone different, someone you had no reason to think could manage?" "Then I'd have made the same offer," he said. "And if you couldn't manage, you'd have left, and I'd have found another solution." He looked at her steadily. "But I didn't think you couldn't manage, from the first second. You saw me for maybe 30 seconds before you made the offer." "30 seconds is long enough," he said. "You were shaking. I could see that from my horse. But your voice was level, and you were looking at your father and not at the ground." He paused. "That's not nothing. That tells you something real about a person." She thought about the street, about standing in the center of all those watching faces with her hands shaking and her voice held steady by sheer refusal. She hadn't known anyone could see the shaking from a horse. She found she didn't mind that he had. "I want to ask you something," he said, which was unusual enough that she went still. She waited. "The ranch," he said. He looked at the table, then at her, with the deliberate effort of a man pulling something up from a level he doesn't usually let people see. "What you said at the south fence, that it feels like yours, that you work like it is." He paused. "I've been thinking about that." "And," she said, "I want to know if you want it to be," he said, "properly. Not just in the way it feels." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the wind moved across the yard in the way it always did at this hour, coming off the ridge and down through the basin, and the sound of it was familiar enough now that she didn't have to think about what it was. She looked at Gideon Holt, at the weathered, careful face that she had spent weeks learning, with its economies and its silences and the rare moments when something underneath it came through. He was not a man who said things he didn't mean, partly because he didn't say enough things to afford the waste of one that wasn't real. "You're talking about the ranch," she said. "I'm talking about the ranch," he said, "and other things if we get there." He held her gaze. "But the ranch first, because I think you know it as well as I do now, and because I've never had a partner in it, and I think I've been running it worse for that." "You've been running it very well," she said. "Better would be the point," he said. She was quiet for a moment. She thought about the morning of the auction and the $50 and what it meant to have been subtracted from one accounting and added to another, not as a number this time, but as a person capable of making decisions about what she stood in and what she built. "Yes," she said, "I want that." He nodded once, with the economy that was characteristic, and then he looked at his coffee and then back at her, and in his face was something she hadn't seen there before, something unlocked, not demonstrative, but open in a way it hadn't been. "Good," he said. It was not romantic in the way stories are sometimes romantic, with speeches and grand moments. It was two people at a kitchen table after a hard several weeks, agreeing to something real in plain language. Elena thought it was probably the most honest agreement she had ever been part of, which made it better than a speech would have been. Well, the reckoning with Caldwell Creek came the following Saturday, not by Elena's design, but by its own momentum. Sheriff Talbot had called a public meeting, the kind held in the church schoolroom when something needed to be addressed by the whole community, to present his findings regarding Cutter Briggs and to formally dismiss the complaint Briggs had filed against Gideon's ranch. It was a procedural thing, in Talbot's framing, but everyone understood it was also more than that. Gideon drove the wagon. Elena sat on the bench beside him, which was the first time she'd returned to Caldwell Creek since the morning she'd ridden out on the borrowed bay mare. Cal Deering rode behind on the bay, which had stayed on the ranch and been absorbed into the herd, and Amos stayed behind because his leg genuinely would not make the trip, though he said it was because someone had to watch the cattle. The town looked the same. It always did. Frontier settlements don't change their shapes quickly. They just accumulate use and weather. The main street, the same buildings, the same wide dirt expanse where she had stood while her father called for bids. She looked at it from the wagon seat as they came down the street, and she felt not what she'd expected to feel, which was something large and confrontational, but something quieter. The street was just a street. What had happened in it was real, and it had not been undone, and she carried it, but it no longer had the quality of a wound that couldn't be touched. It had become something else, something she didn't quite have a word for, a place where a chapter ended and another one began. The schoolroom was full. She hadn't expected that. She'd thought maybe 20 people, the ones with official business. There were closer to 60 standing along the walls where the benches ran out, and they went quiet when Gideon came through the door, and quieter again when Elena came in behind him. She stood beside him at the front of the room, and she did not look at the floor. Sheriff Talbot presented his findings with the same methodical calm he'd had at the kitchen table. He outlined Briggs's complaint and its dismissal. He outlined what had been established regarding the events of the past 2 months, the night assaults, the lie, the documented pattern of Briggs's operations. He didn't editorialize, he didn't need to. When he finished, the room was quiet. Then Mrs. Pullman, from the 4th row, said, "I want to say something." Talbot nodded. Mrs. Pullman stood up. She was not a tall woman, but she stood up straight. "I watched what happened in this street," she said, to the room, not to Elena. "I watched it, and I didn't stop it, and that's something I'll carry." She paused. "What I can do about it now is say it clearly, in front of everyone, so it's in the record. What Harold Ashcroft did was wrong. What Cutter Briggs did was wrong. And what this town did, by watching and not acting," she paused, "that was also wrong." The room absorbed this in silence. Elena looked at the 60 faces. Some of them were embarrassed, some were nodding. Old Pete Larson, in the back row, had the expression of a man who had known something was wrong in the moment and had spent weeks deciding what to do with that knowledge. Gideon spoke briefly, practical as he always was, talking about the ranch and its relationship to the community and the cattle routes and the spring buyers Mrs. Pullman had already begun facilitating conversations with. He did not make a speech about what Elena had done or what she'd been through. He didn't need to, and she didn't want him to. What he said, at the end, was this: "The ranch is going to be jointly managed, going forward. Miss Ashcroft has been running it alongside me since the first week, which you'd know if you'd been paying attention." He looked at the room without apology. "I'd recommend paying attention, because she's going to be someone this territory talks about for a while." Elena stood beside him and looked at the 60 faces and let them look back. She thought about $50. She thought about what a person is worth, and who gets to decide that, and what happens when someone refuses the number they've been given and assigns themselves a different value, and then goes about proving it every single morning before dawn. She didn't feel vindicated exactly. Vindication was a word that required her to have cared this whole time, what these people thought. She had cared about surviving. She had cared about the ranch, and about Amos, and about the spring running clean, and the cattle in the north pasture. She had cared about doing her work well enough that it couldn't be argued with. What she felt, standing in the Caldwell Creek schoolroom at 19 years old with her blistered hands and her steady voice, was something she'd first felt on the cot in her small room, in the dark, listening to rain on a roof that didn't leak. Quiet. She felt quiet. But it was a different quiet now than that first night had been. That quiet had been the absence of crisis, the stunned still of someone who had just stopped running. This quiet was something you built. Something you earned one morning at a time, one decision at a time, one fence post and water bucket and cold night on a ridge at a time, until the ground under you was your own and you knew it from the inside. She stood in the room and she breathed, and she did not look at the floor. 6 months after the night Cutter Briggs stood at the south gate and decided the math wasn't in his favor, the ranch had a name, not a formal name. It had always been called the Holt place in town, the way properties get named after whoever built them, which is efficient but not particularly true to what a place actually is. The new name came from Mrs. Pullman, who started calling it the Ridge Ranch in her correspondence with the spring cattle buyers, because of the north ridge that ran along the property's back edge, and that had, by then, acquired a specific significance in the story people told about it. The name stuck the way names stick when they're accurate, and within a season everyone was using it, and it appeared on Talbot's county records, and that was that. Elena heard about it secondhand from Cal, who'd been to town for supplies and came back with flour and salt and the information that people were calling the place the Ridge Ranch now. She was at the south fence when he told her, checking a post that had been wobbling since the last heavy rain, and she stopped and looked at the ridge, at the dark pine line running along it against the winter sky. And she thought about lying flat on the oilcloth in the brush at the top of it, in the cold and dark, with the rifle in the canteen, listening for men coming up the north slope. "Ridge Ranch," she said. "You don't like it?" Cal said. "No," she said. "I do." She went back to the post. Cal was a different person than the frightened 20-year-old who'd walked through the gate with a conscience and an empty stomach, though not so different that you couldn't see the line between who he'd been and who he was becoming. Amos had worked him hard, and the work had organized something in him that had previously been scattered. He stood straighter. He moved with purpose. When something needed doing, he identified it and went toward it rather than waiting to be told, which Amos said was the only real measure of whether a hand would work out in the long term. Amos had said this specifically while looking at Elena, and she had not acknowledged that she understood the compliment, because acknowledging it would have embarrassed them both. Briggs's hearing came in February, during a cold spell that froze the top of the cistern and kept the cattle bunched in the south pasture, where the wind was blocked by the ridge. Gideon and Elena rode to the county seat together, a half-day's ride, and testified separately, clearly, with the documentation that Gideon had been keeping in his precise ledger hand for 2 years. The hearing was not dramatic. Real legal proceedings rarely are. It was careful and slow and slightly cold in the county building, and Briggs sat at a table with a lawyer from the city and said very little, and the evidence said considerably more. The outcome came 3 weeks later by written notice. Cutter Briggs's trading license was revoked. He was fined substantially for the undocumented cattle transactions. The assault on the ranch, established through Cal's testimony and the accounts of Rourke, who had, under questioning, decided that loyalty to Briggs was worth less than he'd thought, carried additional penalties. He did not go to prison, which was a limitation of what the available evidence could prove in a court rather than a reflection of what he deserved, and Gideon said so plainly when he read the notice, without drama, but without pretending otherwise. "He'll go somewhere else," Elena said. "Start something similar." "Probably," Gideon said, "but not here, not with these people." She thought about that. The territory was large, and the law was thin across most of it, and men like Briggs found the thin places and worked in them, and there wasn't much to be done about that at a structural level. What you could do was make your own ground solid, and know it thoroughly, and be prepared. That was the actual answer, and it was less satisfying than a different one would be. But it was true. She had spent enough of her life waiting for more satisfying answers to trust the true ones more. Harold Ashcroft died in March. She heard it from Sheriff Talbot, who came personally rather than sending word, which she understood was a form of consideration. He stood at the gate and told her that Harold had been found in his shack, that it appeared to have been his heart, that it had likely been quick. She stood at the gate and received this information and said, "Thank you for telling me." Talbot nodded and left, and she stood there for a while after he was gone, looking at the south road and not quite seeing it. Gideon found her still at the gate 20 minutes later. He didn't say anything, which was the right response. He stood beside her and let the quiet be what it was. After a while, she said, "I don't know what to feel." "You don't have to know right now," he said. "I keep trying to find grief," she said, "and I find—" She paused. "I find that I'm sad for who he could have been, for the man Mrs. Pullman saw before the drink got into the center of him and stayed." She looked at the road. "I'm sad for that man. I'm sad my mother had to leave him and that I never knew what he was like when he was that person." She stopped. "But the man who stood in the street and called for bids, I've already grieved that. I grieved it the morning I rode out of town." Gideon was quiet for a moment. "That's honest," he said. "I'm trying to be," she said. She went to Caldwell Creek the next day and arranged a burial, which was a simple affair attended by almost nobody because Harold Ashcroft had spent his remaining currency on isolation. Old Pete Larson came, which surprised her. He stood at the edge of the gravesite with his hat in his hands and didn't say anything, and she understood that he was paying a debt. To the version of Harold that had existed before, or to his own conscience about the morning in the street or both. She accepted his presence for whatever it was. She did not cry at the burial. She cried once, later, in her room with the door closed, for about 5 minutes, for the father she had never quite had and now definitively never would. Then she washed her face and went back to the kitchen and made supper, and the ranch held its rhythms, and life continued in the way it does when you've built it well enough to sustain itself through the hard weather. Spring came early that year, which Amos said was unusual and not to be trusted, and which turned out to be accurate when a late freeze came in April and coated the north pasture in ice and kept everyone occupied for a week. The cattle came through it without significant loss because they'd been well tended and because Cal had the sense to start moving them to shelter a full day before the freeze hit, acting on something he'd seen in the way the clouds were stacking over the ridge. Elena noticed this and told Amos, and Amos found a reason to walk with Cal through the near barn and tell him what he'd seen him do and why it mattered, which was the closest Amos came to open praise, and which Cal received with the particular pleased awkwardness of a young man who has not been told many times that he did something right. The spring buyers came in May, 12 of them, 3 from outside the territory, a number that reflected the reputation the ranch had been quietly building through Mrs. Pullman's correspondence and through the cattle themselves, which were good stock handled well. Elena sat in on every negotiation, which she had been doing since February, and she participated in them as a partner, which she now legally was. Gideon had formalized it in January, with Talbot as witness and the county recorder's office producing a document that put her name alongside his on the property. She had held the document for a while when Gideon first gave it to her. She'd looked at her name on it, Elena Ashcroft, and then at his name beside it, and at the legal description of the land, the boundary markers and acreage, and the spring that ran clean from the rock shelf on the north slope. "You could change the name," Gideon had said, watching her. "On the document, if you wanted." She'd understood what he was offering. Not just the name change, all the things that went with it. She'd looked at him. "When we do that part," she'd said, "I'd like it to be a separate conversation from the property document." He'd looked at her with the almost smile. "Fair," he said. That conversation happened in March, quietly, without ceremony, at the kitchen table after supper, which was where most of the real things between them happened. He asked, and she said yes, and they sat for a while in the ordinary kitchen in the ordinary evening light, and she felt the weight and the rightness of it. And she also felt, without irony, that she would still get up before dawn tomorrow and haul water and make coffee, because that was who she was, and the document and the ring that Gideon produced from his coat pocket with the slight embarrassment of a man who has been carrying something he didn't know how to present, a plain silver band, nothing elaborate, did not change who she was at the root of it. She put the ring on and looked at it on her hand and then at him. "It's not much," he said. "It's exactly right," she said, and meant it, because she had spent enough time around things that were performed to value things that were real. By summer, the Ridge Ranch was carrying 400 head, a number that had seemed ambitious in January, and now felt like the lower end of what was possible. Cal had taken on 2 of the responsibilities that Amos quietly relinquished, the far fence line, the cattle count in the north pasture, and Amos had taken on the shape of a man who supervised rather than executed, which he did with the authority of someone who has earned it so thoroughly that no one thinks to question it. A family came to the South Road in June, a couple with 3 young children and a wagon that had seen hard use, looking for work. Their name was Devereaux, and they had the general appearance of people who had encountered something difficult and kept going, which Elena recognized and which she had learned to treat as a credential. She stood at the gate and talked with them for 20 minutes while Gideon listened from the porch. The husband knew cattle and fencing. The wife, it emerged, had run a small school in their previous settlement. Their oldest child, a girl of about 12, watched Elena throughout the conversation with the fixed attention of a person cataloging something important. Elena gave them the bunkhouse for the night and told them they'd talk more in the morning. After supper, when the Devereaux family was settled and she and Gideon were at the kitchen table, he said, "The bunkhouse is getting crowded." "We should build another one," she said, "east of the barn. Bigger. If we're going to be the kind of operation that can house families, we need to build for that." He looked at her. "You want to be that kind of operation?" "I think we already are," she said. "The building is just catching up to the fact." He thought about this for a moment. Then he got up and found the property map and spread it on the table, and they sat together in the lamplight and looked at the land that had their names on it. And they talked about what it could hold and what it needed and what they were building. And it was not a romantic conversation in any conventional sense. It was practical and specific and occasionally disagreed upon. But it was, Elena thought, one of the truest conversations she had ever been part of. There is something that does not make it into most stories about the frontier, about women who survived hard things and built harder things afterward. It gets left out because it is not dramatic, because it doesn't have the shape of a scene that you can see clearly. But it is the most real part. It is the morning. Every morning before anyone else is awake, when you get up in the dark and build the fire and put the coffee on and stand at the window and look at the land that is yours. Not because someone gave it to you, not as a prize, not as a rescue, but because you did the work of knowing it and defending it and remaining in it when it would have been easier to go. And you feel the specific weight of that. Elena stood at the kitchen window in the early dark of a July morning, a year and 3 months after a man on a gray horse had ridden into Caldwell Creek, and she looked at the yard and the barn shapes and the ridge above them, the dark pine line against the first gray of dawn. Behind her, the ranch was asleep. Gideon's even breathing from the room they now shared. Cal in the bunkhouse. Amos in his room off the near barn, where he'd moved his few things when the Devereaux family needed the main bunkhouse. The Devereaux children in the new East building, which had gone up in 6 weeks, and which the youngest had immediately and permanently appropriated a corner of as a place to read. The valley was quiet in the particular way of early morning. Not empty, just unhurried. The cattle in the north pasture moving in the gray light, the ridge holding the last of the night against the coming day. She thought about $50. She thought about it the way you think about old scar tissue. Not painfully, not with the fresh sensation of the original wound, but with the particular awareness of something that has become part of your structure. It had happened. A man who was supposed to protect her had put a number on her and called for bids. The number was insultingly small, which was the point. It was meant to tell her something about what she was worth, and she had spent the time since refusing the message without quite being able to articulate why. She could articulate it now. The $50 was never about her worth. It was about Harold Ashcroft's desperation and Cutter Briggs's greed and the specific failure of a community that watched and found it easier to look away. None of those things were her. They were things that happened around her, to her, things she'd had to walk through. But they were not her. What was her was the hauling of water before dawn, the steady voice in the street when her hands were shaking, the walk up the north ridge in the dark with a rifle and an oilcloth and a canteen, because someone had to be up there, and she'd identified that it should be her. The conversations at the kitchen table and the fence posts and the spring negotiation and the Devereaux family at the gate. Worth is not a number assigned. It is a thing demonstrated over and over in the small decisions that accumulate into a life. She had been demonstrating hers since before anyone thought to look. The coffee was ready. She poured a cup and held it in both hands and felt the warmth of it. She heard Gideon's step. She knew the sound of him moving through the house in the dark, unhurried, the way he knew everything about this property, by long familiarity. He came into the kitchen and she handed him his cup before he reached for it, and he took it and stood beside her at the window and looked at the same yard and the same ridge and the same coming dawn. "Cal's up," he said after a moment. Through the window she could see the bunkhouse lamp. "He's learning your hours," she said. "Worse habits to pick up." She looked at him. He was looking at the window with the quality she'd come to know. Present, contained, all of it turned inward and used. She had not, in a year of being beside him every morning, made him a simpler person than he was. He was still difficult in his particular ways, still prone to silences that ran long, still carrying the things from his past that he'd only given her pieces of. She was not simple either, and some mornings they moved around each other in the kitchen with the friction of two people who have strong opinions about how things should go, and occasionally those mornings became real arguments that required real resolution. None of that had made her want to be anywhere else. "Devereaux said yesterday he knows a man who needs work," she said. "Family man, good with horses." "We're at capacity," Gideon said. "We're at capacity for the operation we have now," she said, We're not at capacity for the one we'll have in a year if the fall buyers do what I think they'll do. He looked at her. What do you think they'll do? Come back with larger orders, she said, and bring someone with them. The cattle are the best in 3 counties, and the price we held this spring was fair enough that they'll tell people. She looked at the ridge. We should be building for that now. He was quiet for a moment. Talk to Amos, he said. See what he thinks about capacity. Amos will say we need the man and also that we don't need anyone, she said. Then he'll train whoever we hire so thoroughly that they'll be capable of running the whole operation in a year. The almost smile. Fully present now, more often than it used to be. Probably, he said. They stood at the window and drank their coffee, and the dawn came over the ridge in the slow way of summer dawns, unhurried, the light spreading down the north slope and across the basin and into the yard where the shapes of the barn and the new east building and the cistern and the good fence came gradually clear. This is what I want you to take from this story, if you take anything. Not the auction, though it happened, not the rifles on the ridge or the confrontation at the gate or the hearing and the judgment afterward. Those are the events. They are real and they matter. But they are not the point. The point is the morning. It is always the morning. The moment before anyone else is awake, when a person stands in their own kitchen holding something warm and looks at what they've built and understands that they built it, that it is theirs, not because it was given, but because they remained. Elena Ashcroft was sold for $50 in the middle of a street, and she walked away from it on her own 2 feet, and she kept walking, one morning at a time, until the ground under her was solid and she knew it from the inside. No one gave her the ground. No rescue made her what she became. A man on a gray horse made a fair offer, and she accepted it. And everything after that, the water hauling and the fence checking and the cold nights on the ridge and the negotiations and the arguments and the slow, unspectacular building of something worth defending, that was her. We spend a great deal of time worrying about the number other people put on us, what we're worth in someone else's accounting, whether the price they've decided on is fair or whether the bid is high enough or whether anyone in the crowd will say it's wrong. We wait for the verdict from outside ourselves, and sometimes it comes and sometimes it doesn't, and either way we've been looking in the wrong direction. The only verdict that builds anything is the one you render yourself in the dark before dawn when no one is watching. The decision to get up, to do the work, to know the land you stand on and defend it and remain. Elena Holt stood at the window of her kitchen in the early light of a July morning, and the ridge held its dark line against the sky, and the cattle moved in the north pasture, and somewhere in the east building a 12-year-old girl was already awake and reading, and the ranch was alive around her with the lives of people who had found their way to solid ground. She finished her coffee. She set the cup down. She went to work.